Chris has come up today to talk Heavenly Hectares with us. It's in relation to promoting this NAC Small Landholders Guide.
You meant to do that.
But you were all supposed to get one today, but they're not printed, so we'll post them to you. But if you want to have a flick, this is my copy, so if you want to have a flick through and see what you're going to get, then be my guest. And yeah, I think Chris is going to just run things today. Maybe we'll have a break.
Mm-hmm. We will. We'll have a break. So we'll do about 7 hours, and then we'll have a break.
7 hours.
There's always someone who goes, oh my
God. Toilets, if nobody knows, they're just round the corner, so just go out and just follow that round, and the lights are on now.
Oh good, I fumbled around there going.
Oh, did you?
I cursed electricians because you're going, where's the light switch?
Right, okay.
Thank you, Rachel. And it is a great privilege and an honour to come up to this part of the world. Who's based in Perth and has bought some beautiful piece of land up around this part of the world? So absentee landholders. I always love to do a bit of a straw poll. Now, who also gets a little bit narked at being called a hobby farmer and says, I put a hell of a lot of work into my place and it ain't a hobby, it is a labour. Okay, so small landholders, to me, I think kind of fits the bill. And I'll explain that as I go on. I am Chris Ferreira, by the way, if you haven't heard that already. So very importantly, small landholders / hobby farmers, recreational landholders, whatever you want to call them, are a huge chunk of what we call the farming demographic. Does anyone know how many small landholders there are in the southwest, which is from Geraldton to Esperance and everything west of it? 60,000. There's only 15,000 bona fide farmers. Now, obviously they have bigger chunks of land, but interestingly, of those 60,000, so you outnumber them 4 to 1 on average. Very importantly though, and I'll just put a few definitions in there. So a small landholder is anyone from my perspective has, say, an acre up to maybe 500 to 1,000 acres. Is everyone in that category? Who's got the classic 5 to 10 acres? Beautiful. Who's got less than the 5 to 10? Yep, how much is 1.5? Who's got more than, say, 50 acres? Yep, okay, so who's got more than 1,000 acres here today? You have? Oh, yes, well, and I guess the other thing I like to say is that the essence of what I'm talking about today is just as valuable whatever the size of your property. But interestingly, of those 60,000 small landholders, a third will sell within 3 years, statistically. Who's made it past the 3-year magical point? Good work. Give yourselves a pat on the back, because that is an extraordinary feat. And we know why. Well, actually, I believe one of the reasons is buying a small farm is one of the great impulse buys. Okay, so people go out on a spring day, they see a carpet of purple flowers, and they go, honey, should we? Yes, we should buy. It looks beautiful. You're backlit by the sun. Let's buy this magnificent property. And on a whim, you impulse buy this beautiful property. Now, it probably is a beautiful property, but like all of us, we're not beautiful for 24 hours a day for the rest and all of our life. Everyone agree with that one? Yes? So the important thing is that we very rarely see that property over the course of 12 months. Why do you want to see a property over 12 months?
The season changes and everything else.
Indeed, I say that rural real estate agents don't sleep from about June through till, say, mid to late October. They're on amphetamines, because that's when you flog properties, because they look magnificent through the winter and the spring. But as we know, as the season kicks into our semi-arid summer, all properties start to lose a bit of their gloss and their shine. But the important thing is that you guys, as small landholders, have, I believe, 4 things working against you. Number one is, not necessarily are you farmers. Would that be a fair thing to say? But you need to think like a farmer. So many of the issues and the things that you need to do and want to do on your property are the same on a smaller scale, but what a farmer would need to do, dealing with weeds, managing stock, dealing with the issues of drought, fire and pestilence and all those other great plagues. So the other thing that's working against you is not necessarily do you have all the right equipment to do the right things at the right time. Who's ever tried to get a contractor out to do things on your property? Okay. And there's no such thing as the yellow pages where you flick through a suite of fantastically well-educated and certified small landholder contractors. In a parallel universe, that's probably the case, but it ain't here. So you often struggle to get the right person to do the right thing at the right time. And you've probably learnt by the hard way, maybe, that everything on your property is about timing. A farmer doesn't sort of go, I might go sow those crops sometime in the next couple of months. Do they? It's right down to the precision, and you need to be doing the same. So if you can't get the right contractor at the right time, often that means you can't get the real success that you want. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, especially in relation to pasture. But I'll go on with that in a minute. The other thing that's working against you is you may not have all the right equipment yourself, so that makes it difficult. And then finally, you may not be connected into your neighbourhood, so you don't know who is the really good contractor, or you don't know who Sidelines is a fantastic fencing contractor. So until you get those skills and those resources and that know-how, it really is difficult to make sense. And one of the reasons why people sell within 3 years, a third of you, is that the dream, that impulse buy on that beautiful spring day when you said, honey, we can create this beautiful place, we can escape the suburbs where it's a sea of shimmering houses and whirring air conditioners. The sea of those houses and that vision that you're trying to escape, often you begin to realise, wow, it's hard work on the farm. I can't get things done when I want, so you become reactive. You're busy trying to deal with one mini crisis on the property after another, whereas people who get joy, pleasure and make progress on their property have shifted from being reactive to proactive. Right, guys, what are we doing this year? What's the plan? What do we want to do to shape and evolve and hopefully turn this piece of land into something more beautiful, productive and sustainable? And when you can do that, when you are really at the helm and guiding your property, that's when it is an extraordinary experience. But a lot of people, as I said, find it tough. Who's in that camp where you're going, oh my God, it is hard work? You all know. Yeah. Okay, and look, the reality is that it is a big issue. Now, I've been running these workshops with various people for at least 21 years. So we started doing these workshops with Men of the Trees, and in that time, I've seen over 12,000 small landholders. So we've seen a lot, and I'm going to ask you very soon, what are the reasons why you've given up your Saturday? You could be listening to England being flogged by the Aussies in cricket, but no, you're here. I hope they're still doing all right, but they got a bit wobbly when I was listening this morning. But why are you here? What are the big issues you'd like me to help you with? And that's what I'll use to guide and shape where we're going. Okay, so who's going to be first to... Yes?
One thing that absolutely drives me crazy on our property is I can't, and I know the answers, but I can't seem to get there, is keep the soil moist, because every time I'm watering my garden and water's running off, I add all the nutrients, I see soil, I don't dig in crap, and the next week it's the same again, and it's freaking me out.
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. Hopefully we got that one loud enough to be taped. So what you're talking about in a nutshell is the dreaded curse of water repellency. Yes. Who's noticed that? If you haven't noticed it, and I'm not being rude, but I don't think you know your soil well enough. And I'm here to say that if you don't know your soil, if you don't know the different matrix of the soils that you have, you're not really going to make a lot of headway in creating a beautiful property. Because when you see a magnificent property and you find the owner who set it up and has managed it, they know their soils and the different changes and the complexities very well. So water repellency is a massive issue, and I'll talk about that one. One of the mantras that I'll talk about today, in fact it's so important I call it the 11th commandment. And we all know about the first 10, we'll probably ignore the first 10, but please don't ignore the 11th. As landholders it is, thou shalt use the water and the nutrients where they fall. Because if you have water repellent soils, you're breaking that commandment, which means that your soil is not working for you. I'll go into so much more detail about that one, but that's critically important for anyone with sandy soils. Who's got sandy soil? Okay. Who's got gravelly soils? Same issues again. Who's got clay? You know, good boggy squelchy clay? Yep, okay. Who's got some lovely loamy soils? Right, you're showing off now, okay? Right. It's all going well until you show. Okay, so in this part of the world, as you probably know, we were at the end of the queue when soil resources were being handed out. They went, oops, nothing left in the cupboard. You can have all this horrible grey sand that no one really wants. And we've been blessed or cursed with some of the worst soils in the world. You probably may or may not know that. United Nations sent out a delegation of soil scientists to catalogue the soils around the planet, to just kind of give us an idea on who's got the best, the worst and how they're distributed. And those soil scientists found that the grey sandy soils that dominate so much of the Swan coastal plain and further north, typically before someone puts a bulldozer to it, they have banked woodlands or low jarrah and marri forest. The grey sandy soils have been declared the worst soil in the world. And you think, surely, I've seen pictures of Afghanistan and Iraq, surely that's worse. They're actually much better soils, particularly those sands, than we have here. And one of the reasons why they get the gong as the worst soils in the world is that water repellency. So we'll talk about that one. Big issue. Other issues people would like help with? Yes?
How to create pasture from a paddock of weeds.
Okay, hallelujah. And this is a bit of an ad break. We have got some pasture field days coming up. So we have 2 in December, if anyone knows about those, and we'll go into lots of detail. A whole 3-hour workshop on designing and creating beautiful pastures. And I'll talk a little bit about this today, but it is a massive subject. So if anyone is interested, the flyers there. It's all free. But setting up good pastures, who does have stock on their property? Sheep, cows, horses, giraffes, alpacas, a couple of sheep to fall into the freezer, that kind of idea is the lawnmowers. Okay, so that's a really important part of a good property, is to have the holy grail. Oops, you're not meant to do that. Sorry about that. That's my partner and my beautiful baby boy. Pest management, hugely. So when you say pests, you're not talking about hubby or the kids. I assume you're talking about rabbits. Others? Parrots, yep. Kangaroos. Who's got problems with kangaroos? I always say that you can tell a seasoned veteran on the small farm, because they go from saying, oh, kangaroos, to what are those bastards eating now? Because they can cause massive amounts of problems on the property. I'm not saying that we go and cull them all, but the reality is they are, at certain stages, a major impediment to you trying to get things to grow, particularly if you're an absentee landholder. Other issues people would like to have? Yes?
How to, we've got some sand areas that we would like to actually rejuvenate the native.
Okay,
So,
beautiful. So how to improve those sandy soils? So that's a bit, I'm getting a bit of a thing.
like, how to sort of go backwards, I suppose. If we have one border against the national park.
Okay.
So over there, lovely natives, and over our side, just grass and weeds. Yeah.
So, restoring the bushland?
Yeah.
Absolutely. We'll talk about that one. Who has the howling easterlies, etc., marauding across the property? And whatever the wind is that you have, it's a massive issue for us to deal with. So I'll talk about strategic revegetation. Now, I am a passionate advocate for tree planting, but it's always prefaced with the term strategic. Put the right plants in the right place for the right reasons. It's critically important. And so much of today is really about design. So we'll talk about that one. Other issues?
Well, if you alter the structure of the land, then surely you change, like the kind of plants that can
Indeed.
grow in there. So
Okay, so that's a good philosophical question there. So is the land being altered so much that different species are needing to grow there? Absolutely. Sometimes, to me, a piece of land is like pulling someone out of a terrible car wreck. We might be able to save their life, but they'll probably never be the same again. And some of our land is so degraded and so different from what it originally was that we probably can't put straight back the locally endemic species that were there. Maybe. Salt-encrusted landscapes. They probably can't grow the species that originally grew there. That doesn't mean we can't grow plants. We just need to think a little carefully and use the broad suite of tools that we have, many of which are plants. So yes, I'll talk about that one. Other issues people would like help with? Yes?
And like weeds, like the arum lilies in the marshy.
Okay, so weeds. So what are the major weeds we have? We've got arum lilies. What other ones people would like help with?
Cape tulip.
Cape tulip, beautiful. Patterson's,
Lovely.
and lovely purple wildflower.
Although the beetles are on top of it.
Aha, okay, and we'll talk about those biological controls. Other
Who
issues?
gets to say something's a weed?
Okay, well that's a great question. Wow, you two are from Philosopher's
Because
Corner
I love
here.
arum lilies.
Big bud?
I love arum lilies.
Indeed. Well, I guess the definition of a weed from a land management perspective is that something that is in the wrong plant in the wrong place. Now, what that could mean from a land management perspective is that they are aggressively pushing out or forcing out many of the species that would have naturally been here, or they're compromising agriculture because they're poisonous, or they aggressively overtake the preferred pasture species. So that's the broad definition we'll use for weeds. Some of them are so noxious, in other words, they're poisonous, or they have big, nasty, spiky seeds. We really all need to work together to get rid of them. So I'll be working from the premise of saying not all weeds are as bad as others. Some of them, I believe, you can tolerate in your landscapes, particularly if it's a pasture. And I'll talk about a good pasture is one where you will have a suite of species. Some of them are declared as weeds, but they're not necessarily that bad if they're well maintained and managed. Yes?
There was a recent question on 100.1 with regards to error release. They did not understand that it is a declared weed and it is not allowed to be sold or cultivated in any way, shape or form.
Absolutely. So there's a whole legality in relation to some weeds. You may have heard the term declared weed, which legally means you're not allowed to have them or allow their spread. Now there's issues in relation to land management and how much money is given to our land management agencies, most notably Department of Ag. Because they've been gutted by successive state governments, they don't have the funding anymore to police the management of those plants. So we now have a line where, well, they are still technically declared plants, but we're not going to supervise you or enforce you removing them. That's the state of play at the moment. But some weeds are worse than others, and the declared weeds are generally those that really are aggressive and will cause compromising to agriculture and or biodiversity of bushland. Okay, other issues?
Grass.
Yep, so Guildford grass certainly fits into that category with the little pink flowers, yes.
If you control them, I've noticed like you get impacted by one kind of weed and then you think, oh, you get rid of that. Then another month down the track, there's another kind popping up. So you've got an elongated period of time.
And when we talk about weeds, we'll talk about the whole strategy and some of the ugly truths that are waiting for you. And it sounds like you've already come on to those, which is the idea of getting rid of one weed and your problems are solved is a little bit of a myth. And I guarantee a lot of people that sold their properties, if you ask them, oh my God, I could hardly leave the house every time I went out. It seems the weeds were on the march like triffids. They were literally taking over. So weed control is a real science. And the most important ingredient you can add is the healthy dollop of persistence. So I'll talk about weed control. Other issues people would like help with? Yes?
When you do, and I know a lot of people don't use Roundup, but when you do use Roundup, I find if I spray from 6 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock, some of it will work and some of it won't. What am I doing?
Okay, and I won't go into the details about weed control now, but it's enough to say that I'll talk about the science of organic versus chemical, and if you are using chemicals, how to do it so you get the best possible result. A clinical strike, as NATO would say, go in and get the target specific plant without having an off-target effect. And I think what you're talking about is a lot to do with basically how the plant is actually growing at that particular time. So like us, sometimes we're a bit sluggish in the mornings, other times we're aggressively growing, and that is a really important part of good targeted weed control, is to hit the plants when they're more likely to be receptive. So you're already touching on some of those issues. Other things people would like help with?
Just the water itself as well, and the effect of using chemicals like phosphate, is it, or something like that?
Yeah, so we'll talk about how to use the herbicides responsibly. Who's concerned about fire? And you should all be doing that. The big issue that we face, particularly when you move yourselves from the new suburbs, I say cynically, one of the only good things about the new suburbs is there's no fire risk. I mean, there's no trees, so how can there be a fire risk? So the reality is when you move yourself to these parts of the world, you increase the risk of fire. So I'll be talking about creating a fire-safe property. And it is much more than the 3-metre boggy fire break, which some people believe is a level 10 force field. And of course it isn't. And I'll talk about how it's part of an integrated strategy. Other issues people would like help with before we move on?
One will probably
Yes.
come up later is, the lady said earlier about trying to get water in. I mean, I've got grey, white, shit sand, yellow sand, go to limestone underneath, and it just sucks the water like it's going out of fashion. I started using Metalite,
Okay,
which
yep.
I found in veggie capture fruit trees is actually doing wonders. But the thing of putting a bore in it's so damn expensive to go down 260 feet.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone that does windmills, whether it's a worthwhile thought if you could put windmills to go down. I don't even know if I'll pump from that sort of depth.
That's a good question, and I'm not an engineer, but given that until probably 30 or 40 years ago, windmills were really the modus operandi for farmers. I would assume that if you get a decent sized windmill and you have good, strong prevailing winds, it should probably do the work for you. But we'll talk about that, and drought proofing your property. I think it's fair to say that if you live in WA, you have to accept that our rainfall is declining. We basically need to accept that we are at the coalface when it comes to climate change. We are changing faster than pretty much any other part of the planet. and our rainfall has declined significantly in the last 4 years. So when you are designing your property, I think it's safe to say, with a little bit of crystal ball gazing, you need to design your property so you can maximise the efficiency of the water that you have, but you set up systems that are not reliant on large amounts of water. Okay, so on with the show. That says Heavenly Hectares, and my apologies. I'm moonlighting with Keynote and PowerPoint, and my computer and my data projector are not enjoying the Keynote at the moment, but so I'm having to play around. It's not doing quite what I wanted it to do, so I will be swapping around. But the reality is that that's the dream, as I said before. Many of us have that dream of what we want, but the reality is that for a lot of us it becomes a little bit of a problem. We have this dream, but for many of us it becomes what I call the agro acres. It's just not working effectively for us, and that's close to where I grew up, and you can see that very quickly, particularly if we have animals, we can degrade landscapes. And that obviously causes us huge problems. So today, I'm going to talk about all these different things because they're all pieces that come together that help you create a wonderful property. And from my perspective, it doesn't matter what you're trying to do on your property. The way you can tell you have a beautiful, productive and sustainable landscape is that when people, guests, visitors, family, friends come to your property, they get out of the car and they go, wow, your place is looking fantastic. Who gets the wow factor from family, friends, etc.? Who would like that? And surely that clearly means whatever it is you're trying to do, it's working. You know, it might be you have beautiful sea of fantastic pastures in the middle of summer where everything else looks like a set from Lawrence of Arabia. Or it might be that people saw echidnas running across the road as they came in, or bounding kangaroos. It could be any of these things, beautiful, productive, fruit trees, etc. But the point is the wow factor is what you should all be looking for. And I guarantee that people that have that wow factor, if they haven't inherited it, they've got it because they understand all the different components that come together. So whether it is putting in good pasture, building up the soils, good pasture for your animals and frameworks, all of these things come together. And I'll touch on these different points because they all fundamentally help you to get the best out of your property. And just a little bit of history. I grew up on a riding school, a long way, you call it Northern Bunbury. It was just east of Rockingham. And my father, for a sense, again probably an impulse buy, in September bought this piece of land that he decided to put 30 odd horses on it, sandy soil, and the tragic irony is we called it Greenacre, and there was probably nothing green on there at all. That was actually named after my mum's school in Wiltshire. But the point is, by the late 80s, putting on large numbers of horses, our property started to look a little bit like this. Now the point is that this has absolutely no environmental value, really. You know, there's clearly nothing there. It has no economic value. We had to import all the feed to sustain the horses, plus they would get colic with the first green pick coming up, so we'd have to spend money. And of course it has no social value. It's boiling hot in summer, freezing cold and miserable in winter. I mean, who wants to spend time in a landscape like this? And fundamentally, when you weave all of that together, it has very little real estate value as well. I mean, you can buy properties like this anywhere. It is not hard to create a flogged out property. But the point was we recognised we needed to make a change. So we did the design, and then the design became, I use the analogy when you look at a cookbook, and bookshops are full of new cookbooks. I mean, surely you'd think we've reached the point where we don't need any more, but they keep churning them out. You open up the cookbook, on one page will be what? The picture, the inspiring image of whatever it is, and you go, wow, that's really cool. And on the facing page is the recipe. Landcare, getting the best out of your property, is all about recipes. Now, I can tell you now that Rachel will have at her disposal, and through this booklet, pretty much all the recipes you need to either create beautiful bushland or to create fantastic pasture. All the recipes are there, but you just need to get that recipe, follow the recipe, and I will say it again and again, with a healthy dollop of persistence. Because when you can do that, when you can keep the dream and keep the vision and keep moving forward, you will get success. But it's when you follow those recipes that you get real success. So to me, that was the image that we had. It was something that we could use as a family to show us what we wanted and in the future. And that's the property after 12 years of working on our farm. We planted over 30,000 trees and shrubs, fodder systems, we put in artificial wetlands and pasture for the stock. But the key is that that landscape was transformed economically, socially and environmentally, because it now was, we were working with what we had, we understood and we made the best of what we had. And that's what I really want to be able to help you with today. And I talked about the commandments, and number one is thou shalt use the water and the nutrients where they fall. It is so important. So many of the problems we face in WA, particularly when we look at the declining health of our waterways or our water bodies in general, is we've been disobeying that commandment. And you lose because if the water and the nutrients aren't going into the soil, they run off, causing problems in those beautiful river systems that we have. But the other thing we need to remember is your soil is your fuel tank. Okay, so you can have a Maserati, okay, the best car in the world, apparently. Actually, the Tesla electric car is the best car in the world, but I won't go there. But whatever the car is that you have, it's only as good as how much fuel is in the tank. Would that be a fair thing to say? So, if your car doesn't have fuel in the tank, it's not really that helpful to you. Your soil is the same. That fuel tank, that precious reserve of soil moisture, is what determines whether you will have something that can produce and grow over the long, lean summer, autumn months, or whether it shrivels up and dies. Now, every time we don't get the water and the nutrients going into the soil, we're denying access to build up and beef up and top up that fuel tank. Does that make sense? I find that a very powerful analogy to think of it that way. So when you have water repellency, not only is it frustrating because you see the water sheeting off, taking the nutrients and everything else, but you are the equivalent of driving into the petrol station with your Maserati, getting the Bowser and just pouring the petrol all over the side of the car, rather than saying, well, I have to open up and get the spout going into the fuel tank. Very important. And yet we see it so often, these landscapes, just we're not getting the water into the soil. The other one is, thou shalt never leave the soil bare. Now, Australia has a pretty dismal record in terms of disobeying that. You see dust storms, you see massive soil erosion across Australia, and so much of it is because of the fact that we fail to recognise that when you don't keep cover on the landscape, that is really the path towards the ultimate destruction of that landscape. So keeping some form of cover on that landscape is critically important, and we'll talk about those. They're very, very important points. Okay, so if we start with our first thing that we wanted to work through, is to say that so many of the issues that we face in Australia are because we've been very reckless in the way we've managed that land. And I believe, personally, it's because we had an English culture and we just tried to plonk it onto a landscape, taking cool, temperate climates and soils and understanding and plonking it onto very poor soils with a semi-arid to Mediterranean climate. And it was guaranteed to end with massive problems. Salinity, does anyone have any salinity on their property? Now, salinity is an issue with excess water. How is it that the world's fastest drying part of the world's driest continent has a problem with excess water? Because we're not using the water and the nutrients where they fall. So they run off the landscapes, they end up in the lowest point, flooding that landscape permanently. It's not designed for that, so the trees, the natural pumps die. So the salts that are in the soils just come to the surface. The water is evaporated and we're left with an ever more cancerous, crusted, dead salt landscape. We're not using the water and the nutrients where they fall. So much of today is about helping us to come up with strategies so we can make so much more sense of that landscape. Oh, and this will warm the cockles of your heart. There you go. There's the water repellency in its, there it is, bold and ugly, and essentially the major problem is that when that water doesn't go into the soil, we have major issues in terms of, as I said, topping up that soil moisture tank, the fuel tank. So, does anyone know what causes the water repellency?
I think it's the eucalyptus leaves that fall.
Okay, so there's certainly eucalyptus leaves are part of the problem, and the answer really is that any organic matter, wherever we see it, and that can be leaf material, it can be manures, etc., when they break down in the soil, breakdown means that fungi and bacteria in the soil attack it and break it down and turn it into humus, compost. In our part of the world, with the unique combinations of how hot our soils get and the fungi that we have, they release waxes as part of that process. And the waxes are just like grease on a plate. They essentially stop the water going into the soil. So it's firstly a natural part of the biological processes in our soil. So it's an ongoing issue for you to deal with. Okay, it can be solved, you can certainly keep it at bay, but the important thing is that it is a naturally occurring process. And we have this here just to illustrate that when the water can't go into the soil, of course, and it sheets off or it evaporates, you're getting those fertilisers that you probably spend a lot of money on, they're just not going where you want them to go. and they're generally causing problems in our waterways. Okay, so that leads us to, well, how do we use the water where it falls? There are many different ways that we can do that, and I'll talk about these in relation to tree planting, etc. We have the options for deep ripping with a tractor or a dozer. Has anyone used or seen this before? I call it triage for the soil. Now, this was a property I was working on in Margaret River, and that had been grazed for about 80 years. It was so hard you could bounce a tennis ball on it. All the years of animals pressing and compacting that soil, hideously water repellent. So most of that water that hit, particularly with the summer thunderstorms we might get, guess where all the water and the nutrients went? Sheeted straight off. Now this is triage because it's fracturing that soil. On the contour, I'll talk today about the fact that we must go on the contour. Does everyone know what I mean by... And please, if you don't know, you're probably asking a question everyone's too frightened to ask. So contour cultivation means if this is my slope, I go this way. What happens if I go this way? You basically cause massive erosion because you give the water momentum. And just like an avalanche, it's the momentum that gives it the power to cause destruction through erosion. So by going this way, when the water hits, it's now going into the soil and we're creating cavities to get that water into the soil and the nutrients. Other things that we can do, again, there's some beautiful contour cultivation and banks. These are some banks from out in the wheat belt, and they don't need to be big. It depends on the size of the property, but you can put in fancy structures like this. You can just put in small mounds, anything to slow that water down. And of course, one of the great allies is vegetation on the soil itself. Living or dead is going to slow down the movement of that water, and if you slow it down, you've got a greater chance of it going into the soil. And I'll talk about using wetting agents too, and that's a critically important part of getting that into the soil, and soil amendments. They're all part of using the water and the nutrients where they fall. Any questions about that so far? No? Okay, I keep going on bended knee. I'm going to propose to... There we go. Okay, so the other thing, this is a great example of a farm where they've understood the different changes that we need to make sense of. Now, if you want to have a fantastic property, the first thing you need to remember is that it is not one homogeneous unit. Now, if I bring up an example here of dear old John Citizen. Okay, so John Citizen, firstly, this is a plug for aerial photos. Does everyone know the value of an aerial photo? Who's got an aerial photo of their property? Wonderful if you have. It's very easy to get hold of them now, and you can certainly get one through Rachel, the Moore Catchment Council. It's a fantastic tool. It's the greatest tool. In fact, one of the greatest things Australia invented was the process of whole farm planning. Using an aerial photo like this, and I'll talk about how to create a farm plan a little later, but the aerial photo is critically important. Firstly, because it shows you that you have a property that is much more than just what you can see from the ground. We're very limited by the fact we can't hover above our landscape, but when you see it from the air, you see it warts and all. And why do you think this photo is taken in summer? There's a couple of practical reasons why we generally get photos taken in summer and autumn. What's the practical reason?
You can see the dry areas.
You can see the dry areas. There's no clouds for a start. It's hard to take photos when it's green. But the other thing is that when you take a photo in the winter time, here's the same property, the photo in winter. And this is the one the real estate agent wants you to see. But this is the photo that shows you, stripped back, stripped bare, from a metaphorical sense, what your landscape is. And the photo doesn't lie. So where you see dark green areas, and there's not obviously a round circle or a square shape, which means it's been irrigated, what does that tell you if it's got darker green areas? Water soil, so it's lower and it's probably got heavier soil. The lighter coloured sections, what does that tell you? Higher up the landscape, probably sandy or gravelly soils. Now you ground proof this if you weren't sure. Wow, why is that colour? Well, we'll go out, take a picnic, if it's a big property, go and have a look and investigate. But the point is this starts to help you to see that your landscape is so much more than what you thought. And you understand as well that nature has very different ideas on patterns and boundaries than humans do. And one of the best examples I have is from my place, close by to my place. And that's the aerial photo that we had originally for our place, and that's a wetland. Can everyone see the wetland? Now someone in an office, probably in St George's Terrace, which was carving up WA originally, went, well, we'll just put a straight line fence and look at it, right through the middle of the wetland. Okay, now, for a start, what can you see has happened as a result of splitting that one land type into two? One half's been well managed, the other half, well, let's turn it into grazing land. So it's been degraded, it's been drained, it's been turned into something completely different. Whereas the logical thing, of course, would have been to put the fence either there or there. And we've been very poor at working out that we need to follow the natural boundaries, because if we don't, eventually that landscape is going to collapse. And here's a case in point. So here's John Citizen's property. I don't think John's much of a citizen at all, to be honest. He might have the Australian flag fluttering from the homestead, but that doesn't mean he's doing what's best for Australia. So he's probably put 300 sheep in here because he swears that, you know, he's actually related to MacArthur. You know, he goes right back, he's convict stock, and that's what you do when you have a piece of land. You stick some sheep on it. All right, by letting the animals go where they like, when they like, what's happened to this landscape? It's destroyed it. Because unless you go in and say, well, these different parts are needing to be protected, I need to fence and shape and guide where the animals go, they're just going to go where they like, when they like. And so when it's boiling hot or freezing cold, where are they going? Into the bushland. And I do the same if there's nothing else in that paddock, and look at the difference in the vegetation. How do we know that his landscape, his bushland, is degraded compared to the neighbours? Look at the density. Now, the thing is, you'll hear some people tell you that the best thing for bushland is to graze it with animals because you reduce the fire risk. Who's heard that one before? They've heard that one? Now, the reality is that nature abhors a vacuum because it understands the 12th commandment, thou shalt neither leave the soil bare. So when you graze out the understory in your bushland, guess what happens? Weeds come back. So it actually increases the risk of fire. So I'll talk today about managing your bushland, and it certainly isn't by periodic grazing. The other thing is, if it's a boiling, stinking hot summer, where are those animals going to spend their time on John Citizen's property? And in the creek line. Why is the creek line the only area that's going to have some feed for the animals? The water's there, and the nutrients have run off the degraded water repellent landscape. So this is chock-a-block with nutrients and probably the best grazing. It's marginal, but the point is that that's the only area that has some grazing for the animal over the summer in the degraded landscape. Now that is causing massive problems to that waterway, and this should be seen as the veins and the arteries of the landscape. If he grazes this in the winter and the spring and the summer and the autumn, the animals are going to graze it out, causing scouring, they're going to poo and wee in there, so this becomes a nutrient expressway. And it's just dumping those nutrients, all those contaminants, all of that dislodged soil into our precious water bodies further downstream. And that's the reason why our water bodies are in such bad shape, because again, we're not using the water and the nutrients where they fall. So John Citizen has not made the best of this landscape. Now, what do we notice? Why would you have your neighbours on your aerial photo as well? And it's symbolic. It's reminding you that you may have sweated and toiled to be able to afford to buy the land contained within this human boundary, but nature doesn't respect those boundaries. I've been onto farms where I've seen a farmer in desperation put a steel picket and ring lock fence around a salt skull, and it was his way of saying, "Stay there. You can't go any further. I've fenced you in." And of course, now the salt skull is about 50 metres beyond his fence line. Nature doesn't respect those boundaries. If there's a fire racing down this hill, is it going to stop and go, "Can't go under there, that's private property"? It's the same with weeds, all those other issues. And we say, particularly, you want to make sure what your neighbour is up to as well. Who's got the neighbour from hell next door?
Probably the people who live near me.
Now, in seeing 12,000 landholders, we've had one person admit they were the neighbour from hell. Now, if I could get every neighbour from hell to come to one of these workshops, it would be wonderful, because often they're doing it out of ignorance. They probably don't want to be a complete awful neighbour, but they just perhaps don't know any better. They may not know that that seared cotton bush, whilst it is feeding the butterflies, is actually causing massive problems with other neighbours, etc. So the other thing is, it reminds you need to take account of what your neighbours are doing. And many times I've heard people say, for instance, "I do so much work to control my weeds, but my bloody neighbour, they just keep reinfesting my landscape." So we'll talk about those different strategies as well. They're very, very important to making sense. So the aerial photo becomes a very powerful tool. And in the second half, I'll show you some of the ways that we can turn it into a powerful tool. The first thing I wanted to go into in some detail was about creating windbreaks, otherwise known as shelter belts, or in 18th century England they called them breakwinds. But for some reason, I don't know why they didn't take off as a name, but we'll call them windbreaks or shelter belts. But the important thing is that they're designed as a critically important part of making your landscape work. And where you see anywhere in the world where sustainable agriculture has actually, they've hit the jackpot. They've learned how to farm that part of the world for centuries. And there are some pockets of the planet where we haven't turned it into deserts. We've actually learned how to work in that part of the world. And Rachel and I were talking about England beforehand, and you look at places like Dorset and Devon and Somerset, etc., and they've got the balance right. They've been farming those areas for hundreds of years and it's stable. We haven't reached that point yet. It'll be interesting to see what agriculture looks like in 50 or 100 years. But interestingly, one of the great things about, this is a bit of an aside, but one of the really exciting things about working with small landholders is you're far more likely, research shows us, to embrace some of the new technologies that are actually going to be front and centre of sustainable farming in WA and Australia in the 21st and even the 22nd century. So you actually are often the first to pioneer and really try out different things, but very importantly, wherever you go in the world where the agriculture is sustainable, you will see the integration or the retention of trees and shrubs. Always, whether it's the hedgerows in England or we see on terraced landscapes in parts of Southeast Asia, they will integrate and retain various productive trees. And we need to be doing the same. But the thing to remember with the windbreaks, we have to design them properly. And this is what this diagram is all about. So a solid windbreak, where we see either really thick vegetation or a human wall, doesn't work as a windbreak. Because what we want our vegetation to do is to dissipate and slow down and even cool the wind. So when you see your plants doing this, they are slowing down and breaking the worst effects of those hot, dry winds or the cold winds. But the solid vegetational wall, you actually force the wind up, and because they're pushed together, you get stronger gradients. And on a hot day, you get this tumble dryer effect, the hot, dry winds on this side. A good windbreak, on the other hand, should be semi-permeable, about 50% permeable. So that means that the wind starts to be filtered through. And why is it going to be cooler on the leeward side?
Through the trees, it's the tree has the cooling down effect.
And how do they cool it down? What are they doing? Moisture. They're nature's evaporative air conditioner. So by letting that wind filter through, we cool it down, and in the wintertime we get rid of the wind chill factor. Either way, that wind, which is allowed to maraud across the landscape, is degrading and unravelling the efficiency of your landscape. And it, of course, has a massive impact in relation to fire. We'll talk about that one as well. There are some...
Sorry, you can kind of reduce it by about 10 degrees,
It can do, depending on the type of wind that you have. Certainly in terms of wind chill factor, yes it can. Those freezing cold winds, if you have a good windbreak in place, it can certainly drop it by about 10 degrees. In the summertime, it can reduce the wind. Reduce the temperature by about 2 to 3 degrees. That's still significant. But the important thing is there are some design criteria. For every vertical metre of height that you have, every vertical metre, that's roughly a metre there, you get 10 to 15 metres protection on the leeward side and 5 metres protection on the windward side. And you can see it here because the wind is actually, some of it is forced over the top and you slow it down here, so you get a cushioning effect on this side. So a 2 metre high windbreak, and we say this when we do our urban workshops, a 2 metre high windbreak, so that's not very high, is going to give you 20 to 30 metres protection on the leeward side and 10 to 15 metres protection on the windward side. So that's enough to give you shelter across a typical urban property. You might get a 20 metre high windbreak, and of course that's now going to give you a significant amount of protection as well. 200 to 300 metres of protection on that leeward side. And I'll talk about how you can work out the right species fairly soon, but the point is when you design it well, they will slow down the worst effects of the wind and help to protect your property. We call them the green framework of the property. So just like a house is nothing without a good framework, the trees and the shrubs carefully chosen become that framework for you as well.
So Chris, if your land is going up a hill,
yes,
then you have to have a series of windbreaks, because while you're going to get a certain amount, 15, 20 metres or whatever, you've then hit the hill again.
That's right.
And you're going to need another run.
Indeed, and if you, so did everyone get that comment? And so, for instance, if you see well-managed farms on bigger areas, they know where to put the spacing of their windbreaks because they know the top height of the plants. How do you know what is going to be the top height of your plants? It's actually very easy to get that info. Does anyone know how you'd find out? It's actually from going to really good, firstly getting great information, for instance from Rachel. She will have a wonderful species list for the different soil types and the very good nurseries, and part of those, that information is for the different species, what's the maximum height that they generally grow to, and the width, what sort of soils they like, are they tolerant of frost, are they fire retardant, do they produce fruits that are edible, etc., etc. There's so much good information out there now. So you can, like a good landscaper, put the right plants in the right place for the right reasons. All you need to do is follow those recipes. And part of those recipes with planting of plants is to make sure you get the good information to start with. So talking with Rachel, she'll know all the good nurseries as well that will be designed to be creating plants that are of the right style and the right growth patterns for your particular piece of land. Okay, so a farmer, etc., will know the top height, so they will know the distance that they need to put their shelter belts apart to then be able to break the back of the wind that may be building up again. And they need to accommodate machinery as well. So yes, you might be putting in plants that might grow to a top height of 20 metres. So that tells you how much you need to do in terms of distance between those plantings. As a minimum, you might put them a bit closer, but they all work together. Does that answer that question? Okay, so that's a very, very important part of the design. And we can weave in many different things into our windbreaks or shelter belts. And I'll show you examples when I transform John Citizen's property a little later. I've got an electronic transformation, and you'll see that you choose the different species depending on what you want those windbreaks to do in that area. It's all about design. Okay, moving on down, and here's a great example of a windbreak. This is down in Denmark. We've got good trees, so we have trees, we have middle story, and we have understory. And the thing to remember is wind is just like water. It's going to be shaped and guided. So if there is a narrow point, it's going to go through there. And I use the example, if you have water going down a channel at a certain speed, and then you narrow that channel, what does the water do? It goes faster. And the wind is exactly the same. You'll see gaps in vegetation, and I guarantee if there's a prevailing wind behind that, there'll be scouring where that gap is, because the wind is literally funneled through that point. And my dad put in, we had a show jumping arena, and he planted in the mid-70s a single row of trees around the boundary, thinking that would work. Well, what's the problem with a single row of trees? As they get bigger, they drop their lower limbs. So we actually ended up funneling the wind at ground level, and it totally unravelled the efficiency of the irrigation. So design is everything. So we want to have a mix of trees and shrubs to make sure we get it right. And here's some good examples here. So that doesn't work for us. Single trees. And we know that a lot of people grow fast-growing eucalypts because they are like bullets. They take off and they're sort of immune from the worst effects of pests and disease and weeds. They can grow very quickly, but very soon they lose their lower branches and we get the wind funnel through. Plus, a lot of them are not only messy, but that is code for major fire risk. Whereas this windbreak on the side here is a mix of trees, middle story and understory. And getting the balance right, getting those three, is a hugely important way to make sure that you can get rid of the worst effects of the wind. Plus, they then have all sorts of benefits. For instance, maybe wildlife corridors. Has everyone heard that term before? So if you don't know what that means, our bushland once upon a time was a mosaic, and animals could go where they like, when they like. Humans come in, clear that land, so you now have islands of biodiversity, and unless those animals, and in the longer term plants, can move through those areas, then they're ultimately marooned, and a fire or disease or predators can wipe them out. But corridors of trees and shrubs can reconnect those areas and makes a big difference. And here's an example of a windbreak. This is a design we came up with. So trees, middle story shrubs, and you can integrate your fire break. Is fire break the right term for that 3 metre thing? We actually say don't call it a fire break because it's not going to break a fire. It's actually an emergency vehicle access track. That's the key. Think of it as a circuit around your property, and I'll talk more about that, but if you Get out of the idea of calling it a fire break, because it will not break a fire. Unless that has literally been started, that fire, cigarette butt, thrown out a window right next to your fire break, it is not going to stop a fire. But very importantly, you might decide to put it on the inside, you might decide to put it here, but your design allows you to be able to make sense of that. Now, some people don't have a lot of room, and you might say, I can't afford to have a 8 to 10 metre wide windbreak, but that's fine. There are some species, some, not many, but some, that actually retain their foliage to ground level. Now, if that is a design criteria, I don't have a lot of room, then you just choose species that can work in those particular areas. You might say, this is a major fire front for me. I have to design it with fire retardant species. Are there some species that don't burn very well? Absolutely. They're called fire retardant species. There are some that will, as an absolute minimum, slow down the fire. Some of them will even snuff it out. Carob is probably the most famous example of a magnificent tree that if a fire hits it, it just stalls the fire. They just won't burn. It's a beautiful plant. So depending on the particular problems or the issues that you face, you choose the right species. Makes a big difference. Okay. Now there's me with my beautiful friend Sabrina, and one of the things that we say is that when it comes to planting trees, whatever they are, whether you're putting in your fruit trees, or whether you're putting in your native plants, whether you're putting in fodder shrubs, whatever it is you want to do, the physical act of going out there with the family and sticking them in the ground, you know, a weekend barbecue and everyone comes out and plants trees, that's 5% of what's required to turn those seedlings into big, strapping, pretty safe saplings. 5%. What's the other 95% that's required to turn them from a promise into success? Everything. So it's the preparation before and it's the management afterward. Very few plants are going to be able to, within a season, get themselves to the point where they don't need human intervention anymore. I say generally 12 to 24 months is required to make sure they go from this to something big and sexy that only an idiot with a bulldozer is going to really make them struggle. So the important thing is, as Sabs is saying there, apart from green end up, is you have to make sure that you spend the time and the effort preparing before and managing after. And I say to people, if you think you need 1,000 plants, plant 500. So take it out over a longer period of time, because if you put 1,000 in, you might get a 10% survival. And that was enough to make you say, sod this tree planting, it just doesn't work, I give up. But if you put in 500, and you get an 80% success rate, you will fall in love with your plants. Who's done plantings and when they first flower for you in the first, you know, it's like your kids graduating from high school. It's so beautiful and you see the animals coming back. You love that process, but it's pretty bloody disheartening when they die. So put in less and manage better. And I think if you get any piece of advice that is worth taking, I hope that one is one that you can deal with. So part of that process of getting those plants to work for you is most of the time we need to remember that our soils have been completely and utterly degraded by human activities. Who has a piece of land that was once productive farmland, so part of a bigger farm? And you'll know, and I used to walk around when we were doing farm consultancies with a soil moisture probe. So it was a piece of hardened steel and I'd try and push it into the soil. And most of the time you get it down about that far and this thing would buckle and bend and it wouldn't go any further, because machinery and stock compact the soil. Has anyone had a sheep or a cow or a horse tread on their foot? It's not a very nice experience, is it? Horses, we grew up with them, as I said, they're up to 400 kilos. That's not nice when they tread on your foot, but the important thing is that pressure on the landscape over a long period of time does some really bad things to that landscape. Firstly, we need to remember, in its healthy state, the soil is not just the soil itself, but it's a matrix of air pockets. And what's important about the air in the soil? What does it do? Sorry?
Lets the water get down.
Lets the water in, and that's your fuel tank. So each one of those air spaces is going to be a repository for moisture, and it's of course where there's air, there's life. So that's where the biological life is in the soil as well. So when we compact the soil, we are literally squeezing the life and the potential out of that soil. Now that compaction, interestingly, forms generally about 30 centimetres down. The vibrations from machinery and stock, they form what's called a hard pan. about 30 centimetres down. And you'll know this, you might have dug into soil that was compacted and you'll break through with a shovel and it's soft again. You've broken through the hard pan. So deep ripping with a tractor or a dozer or an auger on the front of a bobcat, it doesn't really matter. The point is you're trying to fracture through that hard compaction so the roots can get down, the water can get into the soil, and you start to kickstart the biological life in the soil. So deep ripping, a very, very important part of that process. And then we talk about weed control. And who's got soil that would get waterlogged in the wintertime? So boggy and squelchy. So in those areas there, you may have heard of the process of mounding. Has anyone heard of that? So where you physically create, you take the soil from both sides and you heap it up over the top of your rip line. And it's a way to ensure the soil is better drained, so your seedlings are not sitting in waterlogged soil. Because unless you're growing taro or water chestnuts, not many plants actually like spending the first 12 to 18 months sitting in boggy, waterlogged soil. Okay, unless they're rushes and sedges as well. For some of those areas that dry out very quickly. So who's got land? As soon as the rains finish, you go, well, that's it. Until next rains. It's very dry. It dries out quickly. Sands, gravels, areas higher up on the landscape, where your rip lines are, you will probably plant into a shallow depression. We call it furrowing, and I've got lots of photos out in the foyer there. So we are directing water towards those plants. Water is at a premium there, so we direct it towards the plants. And then, of course, it's the weed control. And when you put your plants in the ground, whatever the size of the seedling, we need to remember that they will need protection from the weeds for at least the first 12, I would say the first 18 to 24 months. Because if there's one Murphy's Law with Landcare, it is that weeds will always, always, always grow faster and more vigorously than your preferred plants. It's just one of those laws. You'll see weeds thriving on neglect. And interestingly, most of our weeds have a completely different life cycle. Most weeds are designed to grow, set seed, flower, set seed and die maybe within 12 to 18, 24 months. Most of our plants that we prefer are going to take many years before they do their life cycle, so they can't possibly grow at the same speed. And the other killer about weeds is, what are they tapping into? Your fuel tank. It would be like someone sneaking in and siphoning petrol from your fuel tank. You're not going to get very far. So those weeds, think of them as one of the major things that are siphoning that precious moisture out of your fuel tank. And some of the best organic farmers I know are really getting success because they kill those weeds early. They stop them from tapping into and plundering that subsurface moisture supply, which your plants are going to need. Does that all make sense? And I love this one here. And it is so important for us to remember that healthy soil equals healthy plants. Now, we've had 70 years of conventional agriculture, which has basically sold us the idea that plants grow because you feed them with salt-based fertiliser. Salt-based fertiliser, which has been the staple of conventional agriculture, and that's famously urea, super, 311, potato E, all those very super powerful, fast-acting, soluble fertilisers. They basically were essentially something that was born out of the end of the First and the Second World War. BASF and ICI had massive armament stockpiles at the end of the war, major downer on their share portfolio. What do we do with all this excess phosphorus and nitrogen? Well, there were studies that showed that they can actually increase plant production. So we had conventional agriculture that was born. Your grandparents grew up knowing that every single skerrick of food that was grown on the planet was grown organically. And we need to rediscover that and see that building up the soil is the essence of what allows us to produce healthy, strong, vigorous plants. So, this is one of the only mathematical formulas I think you need to remember when it comes to farming and land care. Healthy soils equal healthy plants, which equals healthy food, and that then ultimately leads to healthy human beings. Ultimately. Now, I show this photo here. This was a revegetation process that we did. We put in individual plants and we improved the soil around where the plant was going to be planted. We put in soil amendments, which I'll talk about, and we put in some really good high-quality compost. And what that did was it kick-started that soil. And you, when you see this coming up on your property, should you be worried or should you be excited? Not only because you might lick that and have a hallucinogenic throwback, that's fine, but the important thing is these are the fruiting bodies for the fungi and the bacteria that are essential for your plants to be thriving in your landscape. Well over 90% of the plants that grow naturally in our bushland, in our native environments, could not grow without forming a symbiotic relationship with fungi and or bacteria. So if our soils aren't alive, then your plants are going to struggle. So when we see this happening, when we see that springing up through our landscape, we know that our soils are living. And that means your plants are going to do so much better. They're going to be more vigorous, more drought-proof, and they're going to produce quicker and faster. And that's the secret. Healthy soils equal healthy plants. Any questions about that so far?
What about the use of weeds as a pioneering plant?
Weeds as a pioneering plant? Okay. I certainly am a huge advocate for pioneering plants. Because obviously a lot of those degraded landscapes are not as they used to be before, so we need the first 11, if I can use some cricket parlance, to go out there and actually make a difference. Now, we don't have to choose weeds, and if you look at the early permaculture manuals...
No, but if you have weeds, try and work with them.
Okay, so that's very much the line that someone like Peter Andrews takes from Back from the Brink. Has anyone seen the amazing work that Peter Andrews did in northern or mid-New South Wales? So he says, let the weeds stay, even let them flourish. I don't actually take that view. I certainly think that some weeds can be tolerated on the landscape. Tolerate means you can tame. So you might need to slash and mow to stop them from going beyond where you want them to go. If you know what you're doing and it's part of a plan to replace them ultimately with your preferred plants, then do it with caution. But I'm never going to advocate either putting in weeds or letting them run rampant on a landscape, because I actually think it has lots of negative spin-offs as well. Apart from the fact that they can move into areas beyond your jurisdiction, so therefore you're having a negative impact on other landholders or perhaps national parks or reserves close by. So we need to be very careful with the species that we use. There are some great Australian pioneer plants as well, so we can be very careful and choose species that are really well adapted to moving through. And the great thing about revegetation in WA, because it's at least 20 to 30 years old, we actually now know what are very good pioneer species. So again, you could talk to Rachel and she'd be able to say, these are species we know do really well pioneering salt scolds or degraded sandy hills or gravelly landscapes. So we can sort of bypass just letting weeds take over. Does that make sense?
We have like these grasshoppers or locusts as they call them. How do you get, that's another thing.
Can I hold that one there in terms, we'll talk about pests, etc. Interestingly though, one of the best ways to control wingless grasshoppers and locusts, etc., is to put back the understory. Why is that? Why is the understory on a regional scale going to help to control things like grasshoppers? Birds, absolutely. There's some work done in the Peel Harvey catchment, so that's the Mandurah, Pinjarra area in the late 80s to early 90s. Massive revegetation works were done, and it completely nobbled the wingless grasshoppers. They used to accept that every year they get plagues of these locusts, but as soon as they put the understory back, the birds moved in and started to get excellent control. So it's a really important tool to say that good, healthy, biologically functioning landscapes are actually going to be more able to protect themselves naturally against the worst effects. Where are we going? Okay. And that leads to one of the other points I wanted to talk about, which was when we talk about healthy soils, there's a few different things that we can do to make our soils healthy. Number one is, particularly, who's looking at growing some pasture or crops or trees and shrubs for productive purposes? Yep. Then you're interested in how your soil is going. Now, if you go to a doctor and it's not obvious that there's something wrong with you, you haven't got an arm hanging off, if you're just not feeling well or you've been not well for a while, a doctor will probably encourage you to get more detailed testing. It might be an MRI or blood test, We can do something similar or equivalent with our soil. You can get either a soil test or a leaf tissue test done. Critically important. Now, it's a snapshot. That's all it is. It's a snapshot, but it's a very powerful tool because when you get a soil sample or a leaf tissue test of plants in an area that you're interested in working in, you can find out if it's comprehensive and well done. It will tell you for a suite of nutrients what you have in your soil, what you should have, and then what you need to do to get it to the point where it starts to function again. Now, another critically important thing that we know, when you look at soils that have just had the old bag to the acre of super and urea, very chemically NPK focused in terms of their management, we know that that firstly degrades the biological life in that soil. Because those chemical fertilisers, when they react with the water, they form weak acids. Uric acid, phosphoric acid, and or nitric acid I should say, and phosphoric acid, and they will drench through the soil, and over time they kill the biological life. And what happens to the pH of the soil? It goes down. It starts to become quite acidic. Does everyone know why the pH is important, particularly when we talk about soils here? Indeed. And what's the best pH that we know for plants generally? Yeah, 6.5 to 7 is what we call the sweet spot. And the pH goes from about 1 to 14. Now, most plants prefer to be in that sweet spot of 6.5 to 7. The reason being is the pH fundamentally has an overbearing impact on the chemistry of the soil. That's why it's important. So it will determine what is available to the plants. That's why we get interested in the pH. So if your pH is in 6.5 to 7, it means that the nutrients that are in the soil are most likely to be available to the plants. But as your pH moves, it's a bit like the bell-shaped curve. As you go further alkaline or further acidic, less and less nutrients are available. Some become oversupplied in the soil. They become hostile and antagonistic in oversupply. And only a smaller array of plants can tolerate those conditions. So as your pH drops or goes too high, less species grow and less species grow well. So that's why pH becomes important. So a soil test for a start is going to look at the pH of your soil. It's going to tell you what you have in your soil, what's in excess, what's in depletion, and you can start to make some changes. Now, as a passionate advocate for sustainable living and looking after the soil, I would say go to a soil test company that has a real good understanding that the soil is much more than just a black box. You know, it's much more than just throwing in an amount of chemical fertiliser to get a production on the other side. They understand that it is a biological living entity. So the good soil test companies will look at the biological health of the soil, and they'll look at the nutritional standards as well, and they'll be able to steer you towards the sorts of products that are going to make a difference. Very, very important. So here, for instance, on compacted soil, there's David Bellamy standing in front of a big stash of dolomite lime. Now that dolomite is a nice balance of calcium and magnesium. When that gets put into the soil, that can help to deal with problems such as this one here. Has anyone got clay that looks a bit like that in the winter time, or moving into the dry periods? That's called a massive clay, and it is the structure of the soil is such that it's lacking in magnesium. The calcium and magnesium ratio is wrong, so it's not enough calcium, and that essentially is going to mean that soil can't function effectively. Soil test and appropriate use of the right products is going to help to transform that soil and make it more productive. But only a soil test or a leaf tissue test will help you to move in that direction. And there are some very good companies in WA that can do that for you, and that's the great thing. It's starting to change. We have some good products here. There we go. And I wanted to show you this because it just illustrates Okay, so this is from Rodale Institute in America, one of the longest running organic research ag schools in the world. And just have a look at this one here. This was from the impact of drought. So where water was restricted, we had an area that was conventionally growing food, and this area that had been organically managed for at least 30 years. And you can see the difference. And it's shown here in the soil. Look at the organic. The soil is basically, firstly, a lot more biologically active, and it's receptive. And because it's more biologically active, it's what we call more friable. So that means that it can be easily worked. So the roots go deeper into the soil, which means they can tap into that fuel tank in a much better way than the hard, compacted soils. But it's only when you start to embrace the sustainable stewardship of the land that you can move in the direction where the soil is going to be able to provide for you. And that's a very, very important part of that process. And the good news is you can start to get it out in many different ways. So this is one of WA's better organic fertiliser companies, and they're spreading compost onto farmland. They're putting it under, there's a grapevine there. So you can now get organically certified composts that are going to help to stimulate that biological life in your soil, and you can get them spread commercially onto properties. So it's no longer having to buy it in pretty bags and go out there by hand. You can now get a lot of this stuff at the point where it's actually cost comparative with going out with conventional products. Yes.
Can it go on top of vegetation that's already there?
Yep, you can. So this is a pasture area here where this is being spread onto that area. Absolutely. So you can get it and just spread it over the top of existing pastures. You can see here it's being spread around the base of the vineyards, or you can incorporate it into a soil where you wanted to start from scratch and do something again. And again, just showing the difference between soils that are grown in compacted soil, conventional produce versus deep protection of the soil, organically grown. This is a macadamia orchard, and the compost is being spread around the base of those trees. Whatever it is you're trying to grow, there's a role and an opportunity for you to stimulate and build that soil up. And that is what's going to allow you to have much more productive landscapes. At this point, we'll talk about soil amendments and dealing with the dreaded water repellency. Okay, so hands up again, who's got that water repellency they have to deal with? Look at the resigned look on your face. Okay, there's a few ways you can deal with water repellency. Number one is you can use wetting agents. Who's used wetting agents before? Yep. Who's thought they were only the domain of the garden? Most people assume that's what they were designed for. Interestingly, wetting agents were designed by a soil scientist to help farmers in Esperance. So they were originally designed for broad scale use. So you can buy commercial quantities of wetting agents that you can put onto your landscapes. The key with wetting agents to get them to work, ideally, is you activate them. And how do you activate your wetting agent? You've got to put water onto it. When it starts to froth, it's starting to work. So on a landscape, you might say put strips of wetting agent. May not be able to afford to do the whole property, but you might critically put it into certain areas. Put those strips, then activate it so you now have areas that are receptive to the water going in and slowing down that process. If you're putting in trees and shrubs, critically important, particularly for those gravels and those sands, to put it around the plant itself and improve that area, ensuring that water goes into the soil.
Are some wetting agents better than others?
Indeed. Some wetting agents are more equal than others, absolutely. Okay, so there are some very good commercial wetting agents on the market. I use Grosor. That's a very good wetting agent, and you can buy that one in bulk. If you've seen any good oval, you know, whether it's golf course or a cricket field, etc., I guarantee if you talk to the turf managers, they will say they use wetting agents 2, maybe 3 times a year to get the wetting agent into the soil. I say that this is the most important tool you have as a small landholder. This one's for road rage, of course, but this one is to ensure, because it's a scientifically calibrated soil moisture probe. All right, so if it hasn't rained or you put the irrigation on, half an hour after that event, scratch the soil surface. If it's bone dry, guess what? None of that water's gone into the soil. And you're going to have to deal with it with the water repellency. So the important thing to remember is that these things are wonderful for improving the soil, but they will probably exacerbate water repellency. You will still need to deal with that overarching fact that the biology in our soil is going to break the stuff down as it should, returning those nutrients to the soil, and a byproduct will be the waxes and hence the water repellency. Just have a look at your veggie garden. Who's growing veggies? Guarantee if you scratch the soil after you've put the irrigation on, half an hour later, most of that water would have sheeted off. Unless you use a good quality wetting agent and getting the water into the soil, that fuel tank is not being replenished. Now there are organic wetting agents. I use EcoWet, which is a product by EcoGrowth, and that I use in my veggie gardens because some of the things like Grosor, they have chemical surfactants in them. So there is, particularly in food growing areas, I'm just not sure. Not sure, I won't use it in my veggie areas. Okay.
Can I just ask you a question?
Yes.
I don't know if it even makes sense, but I think when I water my vegetable garden with the water from the bore, I think it's got something in it that isn't good for my veggies. I can't prove that. Would that be possible, or would the soil filter it out? Okay, so when we look at our bore water, so that was your comment there, it's another great thing to do with your bore water to get it tested, maybe once every year. Okay, the reason being that your bore water could be going salty or it could be going acid.
Now either way, if it's going too salty or too acid, it's not good news for your plants. Now in some parts of WA, because we plundered that groundwater, and we've plundered, there's no better word to describe it. We have just treated it as this limitless resource. It's still ultimately dependent on what comes from the sky. If our rainfall's declining and we keep plundering those groundwater supplies, they will drop. And who's been in an area where they've seen the groundwater drop over their time? And I know where I grew up, absolutely a massive issue. And if you see anyone that just thinks they can water for, 7 hours a day, keep the pump on, and regardless, that's just totally unsustainable practices. Okay, where I'm going with that is that if that groundwater supply, and you're pretty close to the coast or where a salt seam is, if you exhaust that freshwater supply, salt or acid conditions will move in. And that's why you might be having a problem. So getting that water tested, and what time of the year would you test your water? Summer and late autumn. Because just like the aerial photos, you want to see it at its worst. That's when it's going to cause problems. So get that water tested. If it works out that it's pretty ugly, you might need to shandy it with some better quality water. That might mean putting some scheme water into it. If it's a really valuable crop, you might have to do that.
Where will I get that from?
Okay, or rainwater, whatever you have. Okay, depending on how valuable that crop is. Until you know what the quality of the water is, you can't really come up with a solution. Okay. If it's really very valuable crop that you're doing, you might shandy it with fresher water, or the other alternative is to go to drip irrigation if you haven't done it already. Because spraying water onto plants is the worst thing to do with poorer quality water. So drip irrigation, does everyone know what drip irrigation is? It's not leaky hose, it's got set drippers built into the pipework every 15 or 30 centimetres. It was developed by the Israelis, and the quality of the water that they have to deal with, is just so poor that unless they use this drip irrigation, by dripping it into the soil rather than spraying it onto the leaves, it helps buffer. You might need to change the types of plants that you use. So for instance, on the Ag Department website is a fantastic fact sheet that talks about the different species of plants and their tolerance to salt. So if it is really salty, you might go, well, I'm not going to be able to grow these styles of plants. I might have to move towards plants that are more tolerant. So that shandying, using drip irrigation, are all going to help to make sure you can work with what you have.
Sorry, Chris, on the water, what about HydroSmart? They reckon that it's a system that they can change the molecular structure in the water, like to get rid of calcium.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that. There's certainly technologies that are coming out that are helping us to be able to deal better with poorer quality water. So I don't know, I certainly am open to all that sort of stuff. Does anyone have a grey water system or an ATU on their property? Yep, so that grey water is fabulous stuff. And I have a grey water system at my place, and we get about 100,000 litres of water per year, which would normally have just gone down the sewer. Now that's a lot of water, that's good quality water. Not drinking water, but it's good quality for growing plants. And I would urge you, if you don't have one already, to think about putting a grey water system onto your property, so at least around your homestead you have lots of water. And I will talk about why that's valuable in relation to the homestead when I talk about fire in a little while.
Where do you get your water?
Okay, so you can get water tested at most good irrigation shops. So the Watershed, Total Eden are two that I could say off the top. I knew you would, sorry. Thank you for persisting. Yeah, Total Eden, Watershed, both very... Any good ag supplier, so you guys I'm sure know the ag suppliers in your area. If they don't know a company, they will probably be able to recommend. One of the best things about those ag shops is often the little stash of business cards that they have in there. Because that's often an array of people that do everything from sealing dams to testing water quality, etc. So using that will be really, really important. Rachel, do you have anything to add in relation to that? That was short and sharp, wasn't it? Okay. Okay, we're going to go into the wonderful world of growing pastures now. Any comments about that before we move on? Okay, so hands up again, who's going to have stock on their property or wants to have stock? Horses? Who's got horses? Okay, so you know about the pasture field days we have coming up. If you don't know already, we've got some of the flyers there. Sheep, who's going to have sheep? Pets, yep. Cows, anyone cows? Yep. Alpacas, anyone doing the alpaca shuffle? Beautiful. Okay, whatever the animals that you have, no doubt you would look with envy at anyone that can have pasture growing over the autumn and the summer. You just go, oh my God, it's the holy grail, and it can be done. It can be done. So that's what I'm going to talk about now, is what we call the evergreen promise. And this is in Bakers Hill, where we established some deep-rooted perennial grasses. So I'm going to talk about plants in relation to perennials and annuals. What's an annual plant?
It's just dying off, yeah.
So when does an annual plant grow? How long does an annual plant live?
Probably spring to
Yeah,
summer.
that's right. So basically the winter and the spring, they're the ones that grow when things are great. You know, the time when the real estate agents, well, you know, they owe lots of money to the annual pastures or weeds, because they're the ones that have got some people to go and buy those properties. So the annuals we know, and there they are in all their glory. When you walk through your paddocks in the middle of winter and you get wet up to your knees, most of that is generally annual growth. And then your paddocks wither and die, and you go through the long summer and you swear that land will never recover. I'm guaranteed we won't get growth. But sure enough, the rains come and it starts again. What we need to feed into that is the perennials. Now, the perennials are anything that live at least 2 years. Now, when my dad bought the farm next door, it was an old dairy. It was set up in the 1930s, and it had kikuyu. Now, that kikuyu, assuming it's still being managed well, is coming up to its centenary of growth. Now, that's quite extraordinary, which means that that system will continue to grow and will serve its purpose if it's well managed. So our job is to try and get the best of both. And they're flip sides of the same coin. You don't have one without the other, but ultimately you have the two. And they work in partnership. So who's put in some, or firstly, who can give me some examples of perennial grasses that you might want to put into your landscape?
Yapon, rose grass.
Oh, you've got a lot. And perennial ryegrass. Yes, indeed. You have to be careful about the species. And WA, some of the worst weeds we have are failed examples of perennials that we brought over. African lovegrass, Tambuki grass are tragic examples of early experiments with putting perennials into the system. Kikuyu is another very important one, the forgotten pasture. Now, interestingly, these grasses, this pasture, again, is only as good as what we do with the soil underneath. I passionately believe that. So if you are looking at growing pasture, if you're looking at using this land to grow good, healthy animals, look after the soil. And if you do that, then your pasture is going to do so much better for your animals.
Actually, it's interesting because there are only 2 introduced South African grasses that do not have toxins in them that are dangerous to animals. And kikuyu has been known to kill stock.
It has, and interestingly, that is very much eastern states-based information that's been kind of brought over here. And again, I've run lots of horse workshops, and you'll hear every now and then someone say, oh, but doesn't kikuyu cause big head, which is the toxin build-up? And I say, have you ever seen an animal over here with it? No. It's just something that is prevalent perhaps over east. But it again goes back to the soil. If we build the soil up and we ensure that we have the suite of nutrients, the plants will reflect how well they're being managed. Okay, so how do we get to the point where we can get some good pasture growing? Number one is knowing the difference between the perennials and the annuals. The annuals are famously everything from beautiful weeds like this one. Who has this on their property? The great capeweed. Capeweed's a classic example of an annual. Some of the good guys are things like our clovers, some of the ryegrasses, so there's annual and perennial ryegrass. But the interesting thing is we need to balance and have both. So the key is to get our perennials to grow. What time of the year do you sow or establish your perennials? August, September. Or if you're getting runners, so in this Gingin area you might be able to talk to a turf farm or to a contractor or to perhaps a turf renovator, and you might even be able to get runners. Has anyone heard of establishing grasses that way? So that's another bucket of opportunity. That can be done in March and April, and again in September, maybe October. But the important thing is, if you have sandy soil, your D-Day for putting in perennials is late August. If you've got the heavier soil, you'll be looking at doing it as soon as you can get the machinery on there, which might be late September, early October. But the point is, perennials are warm season grasses. They hate the cold. If the temperature of your soil drops below 12 degrees, they just go into hibernation. But they love the warm, moist conditions. If the soil is warm and it's moist, you could literally watch the grass grow. Okay, So the important thing we need to remember is that you sow your perennials at a very different time of the year to the annuals, which means that people often get it wrong. And again, this is where the recipe is so important. If you mix, going back to my cookbook analogy, if you mix up the different components and you just throw it all in, it's probably not going to work, but you need to follow the recipes. So step number one, getting these deep-rooted perennials in place, you would ensure that your paddock is bare. The one time we'd advocate a bare soil, or a dead soil, as in there's nothing living on there, is when we're about to establish our perennials.
So you have to get rid of the weeds first.
Absolutely. As I said before, weeds will always outcompete our preferred plants. It's just a given. Don't know why, it's just one of those laws of Landcare. Even if the weeds are only this big, they will still smother out and kill your preferred plants. So you have to have 110% weed control when you establish those plants. Fastidious about your weed control. And you sow them, as we said, to your beginning. And why late August, early September? What's happening at that time of the year? We're moving into spring. It's still warm. Sorry, it's moist, but it's starting to warm up. Now, interestingly, a lot of those beautiful contractors that you might know in your area aren't necessarily up with the latest information in relation to land management. And they might say, no, my dad was sowing things in this part of the world since the 30s. You always sow beginning of May. Now that might work for the annuals and putting in oats and crops like that, but they're very different plants. Their physiology is completely different. If you put your perennials in at the time of the year you would sow your clovers and your oats and wheat, you will kill those plants. They just won't grow because it gets too cold and they just sit there and they rot. So don't be swayed by someone who's been contracting in the area for 50 years. What do you bloody know? You don't even live in the suburb, that kind of thing. You need to make sure you keep following that recipe. So, excellent weed control. You put them in at the right time of the year. Now, the other thing is you can establish these plants and you will be so excited about this. The other thing about the perennials is it stretches that production. So you now have something growing over your landscape throughout the year. So here's the hypothetical. We're in the middle of January, okay, it's hot and dry, we suddenly get a thunderstorm. 15 mils of rain lands in about half an hour. You can divide the farming community into two groups. One group that says that bloody was the worst thing, it scoured my paddocks and I lost massive amounts of soil, and those that just can't wipe the smile off their face. Which group is the perennial farmers? Because those perennials are sitting there and they're just in idle. Okay, the engine's idling, you get that rain, and they launch into third gear and off they go. They turn that water and that nutrients into production. The water was used where it fell. The annuals, where nothing is growing, there's nothing to take advantage of that. There's probably nothing to hold the soil in place, and you get massive erosion. And I remember walking through the bottom of the Avon River after they'd had a massive deluge of summer thunderstorm. And the detritus in the bottom of the river was this high, just leaf litter, soil, and that is going to rot down and cause all the problems that we see in the lower reaches of the Swan and the Canning. It would have led to algal blooms and fish kills. We weren't using the water and the nutrients where they fell. So we lost productive potential and we caused massive degradation. So perennials offer so much to us. And that's the same with trees and shrubs. A summer thunderstorm and you will see this beautiful burst of growth, and you should know that that fuel tank has been topped up and that water and nutrients has been turned into something productive on your landscape. That's not to say that our annuals aren't essential, because when these guys start to slow down and hibernate when it gets cold, these guys take over. And they will happily grow over the top, and these guys will happily sit there dormant, just ticking along, and then you get the production over the top. So the farmers that have embraced this find now that they have stretched their productivity. You can have both. Now, if you want to know more about this, again, Rachel will have so many wonderful examples of perennial farming. It's so exciting. And there's the Evergreen group, the Evergraze group, and these are groups of farmers that are out there. Go to their field days, and Rachel will probably be involved in running a whole suite of those workshops. It's so exciting, this stuff. It really, if it's done well, will just transform the productivity, and you'll get that wow factor, which you're looking for. So who's got some perennials? It sounds like you have some perennials doing their thing.
Yeah, about the perennials, the biggest problem I had was we had high winds coming, which then dried a lot of the dirt on the top and filled the ruts in. Then we had something like the eternal middle of rain, which further washed the sand into the ruts as well, burying the perennials to a depth which was not really acceptable, excepting that I have had germination.
Yep.
Now I'm worried about not getting enough moisture to retain that germination.
And if I could look from a holistic sense, I would say the number one thing you need in any of these landscapes is those green frameworks. So to be able to slow down the worst effects of those prevailing winds would be able to create the microclimate, so whatever it is you're trying to grow does that much better. Whether it's mandarins cracking and dropping off the tree too early, whether it's putting your pastures and getting that good productivity. Those green frameworks, those shelter belts will make such a difference to improve that effectiveness. Any questions about that?
On the other countries, is perennial process. Is there under the eucalyptus, is there a problem? Because I have areas where it seems to kill off anything at all.
Okay, so it depends on the species that you have. Do you have wandus growing on your property? The lovely smooth white trunk? Like, yeah. Okay, so wandus, yeah, Rachel's giving me a look like maybe, maybe not. Well, famously, the reason with the wandu is that they actually exude a toxin in their leaves, an allelopathic effect, to kill anything growing underneath them. The other thing about eucalypts in particular is that they're just like a high-performance car, and they're not magnanimous. Their job is not to look after everyone else. They're saying, I'm going to take as much water and nutrients for myself. And in a landscape which is like this, that makes sense. The other thing, of course, the leaves, as they break down, release waxes. So if you're going to try and grow things under trees, you need to firstly deal with the water repellency, so you can get the water, and that will benefit that tree as well, because you're getting water into that fuel tank for everything. But growing pasture under those trees, unless they're scattered through the landscape, is quite difficult, because your pastures need at least 5 to 7 hours of sunlight a day. If they're not getting 5 to 7 hours of sunlight, they're just not going to grow well, because they're not getting enough photosynthesis to be strong and vigorous. So if they're scattered through, then they're going to get enough sunlight, and you should be able to grow pasture underneath. But if it's dense vegetation, no, it's not an area for pasture, it's an area for regeneration with shade-tolerant, understory native species. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Would you say then that you shouldn't use eucalypt leaves for composting?
No, that's in. So
they do.
They can. There's nothing, and I just spend my time trying to talk up the values of trees, and it's so pervasive, this idea that gum leaves are. We hear people say gum leaves are poisonous. And I very politely say, well, if that was the case, how could we have 1.5 million hectares of forest? Thank you very much, but it doesn't grow with any intervention from humans. No, it's not the problem, it's the waxes, and the fact, as I said before, they take a lot out of the soil because they're growing, and therefore they don't really let anything else grow. So people assume the soil is poison. It's not. It's just those combinations. So eucalypt leaves do have nutrients in them. So the key is, if you put them with a suite of other species into your compost mix, manures, lawn clippings, shredded newspaper, sawdust, etc., they will break down and produce magnificent stuff. The best mulch for the soil is street tree prunings. So if you have your own tree lopping or mulching machine, and you can just feed that stuff through, magnificent for the soil. So there's nothing wrong with that at all. But it is like a plate of Brussels sprouts. And as they say, what's the difference between Brussels sprouts and snot? You can't get kids to eat Brussels sprouts. So from a from composting microbes point of view, it's like a plate of Brussels sprouts. It's not that appetizing. And there's always someone who says, what are you talking about? I love Brussels sprouts. But most of us normal people think, yeah, I might have them with everything else. So just to ensure you have a suite of other stuff. We're going to have a break now. Any questions before we yes?
In the processes here, you've got to get your soils right first before you plant these other grasses. But the existing ones that we've got, like love grass and all that, you've got to get them out first.
Well, you do. Before I have a break, I'll just talk a little bit about these guys. Okay, so African love grass. Hold that thought. We'll talk about weeds afterwards. Okay. Who's put in some of the fodder shrubs or fodder trees onto their landscape? Okay. Now, interestingly, it depends on where you are, and the fodder species change depending on where you are. This was on my farm. There's that good old gut sandy soil, and we put in Acacia saligna and Tagersasti. Now, these are fodder plants, but I say if you're going to stick them in, you have to bolt to the word fodder the word hedge. If you're not managing like a hedgerow, then don't bother with them. You will see Tagersasti, almost to the height of that foil, and Acacia saligna the same, if they're not managed. Now, unless you have giraffes on stilts, what's the bloody point of those plants? They're not working for you. I had a friend who had these beautiful big white sapotes, great tree, but all the fruit was so high up in the air that you can't ever use them. Any animal, any food plant, whether for you or for your animals, if it's not at the height where the animals can use it or you can access it, there's no point. You have to manage it. So, if you go down Darrigan Way a little bit further north, you'll see it looks like you've stumbled into Lilliput. You'll see Tagasasti this high, and it's been trimmed and hedged because the animals are sheep, and therefore they need to have it at the height the animals can use it. So these plants are magnificent, and they have huge productive potential if you manage them as hedgerows. Now, we say to people, if you think you need 40, plant 10. And that comes from my own experience. We put in 3,000 fodder trees, fodder shrubs for the horses, and I assumed in my utopian vision that all the people at the riding school, normally girls, because girls get into horses, they'd all go out there and they'd cut the Tagasasti and Seligna to feed horses. Of course they didn't. So I couldn't manage it all, and it got big, ugly and messy. So they take a lot of work. This is the first plug for a boy's toy. So if you are going to have them, get yourself a big, sexy, petrol-driven chainsaw or hedging machine so you can go along and just trim them. Keep them trimmed. That does three things. Number one, it stops them senescing. Senescing is a fancy way of saying that they're designed to be pioneer plants, live fast, die young, have a good-looking corpse. So if you allow them to flower, they get the message, my time's finished, and they die, and they're pretty ugly and messy. But if you keep trimming them, you stop them senescing. They keep going, well, I have to keep putting on vegetative growth, I'm not allowed to flower. Plus, when you keep trimming them, guess what they do? You train them to do what? Grow sideways. And famously, Rachel comes from the land of hedgerows, where some of those hedgerows would be hundreds of years old. They've been trained to grow this way. So when the plants grow this way, guess what? They actually start to become fence lines. They become living fences or hedges. We call them fedges. That's a permaculture term, where they grow so thick animals can't move through them. So it's a living, productive fence line. And the other thing, by doing it this way, by spreading them this way and keep trimming them, they keep putting back new growth, which is vegetative, and it's fresh and it's palatable. So keep them trimmed, and they work for you, and they are extraordinarily valuable plants that bring nutrients from deep in the soil. Tagasasti in particular gets a very bad rap as a weed. Well, that's more an indictment on us as land managers than that plant. It's an extraordinarily productive plant. But I wouldn't put it within 100 metres of my bushland, and I wouldn't plant it if I'm not going to have stock, because it's the wrong plant in the wrong place. But if I'm going to have animals, and I've got some very poor sandy soil, this becomes a critically important plant for me. But temper it and put it near bushland, because it can potentially become a weed. Does that make sense? Trying to weave all those things.
Saying the Seligna will keep growing, and when it's short-lived.
It is. Now, interestingly, another sad indictment. If I had my way, we would fund our research and development arm of Department of Agriculture, because we've only just begun to realise the potential of this plant. In Egypt, they have over 15 different species for productive use of what we just call Acacia Seligna. We haven't done the research. To me, we should be spending a lot of time and energy and money breeding the different varieties. So we have Seligna that grows prostate, we have Seligna that's wonderful for fodder, some for seed production, and we can do that. We just haven't done the research. So at the moment, Seligna's a bit of a lucky dip. We don't really know. Some of them are great for fodder, some aren't so good. But keeping them trimmed will sustain them for longer. Other famous ones to use are the salt bushes and the blue bushes. Beautiful plants, wonderful. And again, Rachel's got some fantastic info on these fodder plants. Fodder trees, carob is my personal favourite. Mulberries, much maligned, fantastic plants, so tough. But the carob, if you particularly have gravelly soils, carob is just one of the most amazing trees to have on your property. Fire retardant, and it produces these beautiful sweet pods through January to March. So you have energy-rich foods at a time of the year when your animals are seriously going to be scrounging around for good quality feed. Or you, that's right. So carobs, a beautiful tree to put on your landscape. Okay, on that point we'll have a break. When we come back we'll talk about weeds and a little bit more about fire safety and then some design ideas. What I didn't say in terms of water repellency and improving, this is for anyone with that horrible gutless sandy soil. Hands up who's got the horrible gutless sandy soil. Where you look at this and you go, yes, I didn't need to be reminded. There are some very cool things that are coming out as soil amendments. Now, soil amendments are designed as broad-scale additions to that horrible sandy soil that will permanently improve its ability to hold on to water and nutrients. Permanently. Now, when we do our gardening workshops, Great Gardens, we talk about adding the bentonite clay, which I think you mentioned you do, and that's wonderful, but that's obviously not going to work for large areas because of just economies of scale. So if you are interested in some of the soil amendments, there's a new one out from the Water Corporation called Lime Amended Bioclay, and they've just got approval to do some selected releases of this in the Ellenbrook catchment, and the hope is they'll be able to have it available for you as broad-scale landholders for any regions with horrible sandy soil. Now, we'll be doing some trial demos, installations of it at our Pasture Field Day coming up. There's one on the 8th and one on the 15th of December. One's at Brookley, you probably know Brookley, just Great Northern Highway near Belvoir. Yeah, and then the other one is at one of the riding schools, sort of Pinjar way. So if that interests you at all, grab one of the flyers and you'll be able to see more about these soil amendments. Yes.
For those of us that are on very limited budgets, is there, what can we use that's already on our property? I presume it's composting and things like that, but
that's
there's not a lot of money to be spent to bring things in.
Okay, so the comment was, what do we do if we don't have the money? Composts, etc. are fabulous, but you'll probably know when you add your compost to your sandy soils, if you stop that process, guess what happens? You revert back to what you had before. So in WA, with our unique, horrible sandy soils, unless you add in a clay-based product, you're never going to be able to get to the next level. Because until you have those foundations, it eventually just doesn't stay in that soil. So there's no substitute for putting in soil amendments. Now, farmers, being wonderful, pragmatic people, if they've got 100 acres and some of it's heavy clay and some of it's gut sand, guess what they do? They take the clay from those heavier areas and they incorporate it into the sand. And it's a fabulous thing to do. But most of us don't have the luxury of those different types of land on the one property. So the soil amendments, there's no substitute for them. Now, these soil amendments, you won't get them any cheaper than this because it's firstly a product of the Water Corporation. It's basically your sewage that has been composted, added with this lime, and it's basically something they have lots of, and it's been totally approved. What's that?
Is it all right for vegetables?
It is. It's basically been health department approved. So if you have horrible sandy soils, I've been mixing this in, but it's not a substitute for all the compost and everything else. It just ensures that what you add stays there. So it really adds. What's that?
What's it called again?
This stuff's called lime amended bioclay.
And is it out and about already?
It's getting to that point. So this will be the first launch of it. Yeah. So if you come to the field days, if you lime amended bioclay, which is a fancy way of saying composted human sewage. But look, it's been fully health department approved. So you can be pretty. It's totally cool stuff. On my farm, that horrible gutless sand, in fact, on this paddock here, we spread red mud, which was the waste product from Alcoa minus the aluminium ore. It's just lots and lots of iron oxides. We spread that on this farm in 1992 in this very paddock. It's still there doing its thing. So adding clay is nothing new, there's nothing arcane or mysterious or sinister about it. It's just getting the broad scale quantities at reasonable prices has been difficult. So I think this is really worth investigating and having a look at. Okay. All right, this gets me very excited. Growing trees on farms. For timber, has anyone thought about growing timber trees on their property? Beautiful. Now, I had to go all the way to New Zealand to see Australian trees grown well. Now, the trick is we grow blue gum farms in WA and they're miserable. Skinny, low value, ugly looking bloody plantations. Now, a farm forest should, with any apologies to anyone who has a blue gum farm, but compared to...
Bit late now.
Okay, yeah, a bit late now. But this would have started off life at the same densities as a blue gum farm. Generally in WA, high rainfall, we plant them at about 4 metre by 2 metre spacing. That's 1,250 plants per hectare. Trouble with the blue gum farms is they plant them and then leave them. And then they come back and they're all skinny and then they harvest them for pulp to make paper. But what you do with a farm forest is you start off at the same density, but you then weed out everything but the alpha males, or the alpha females, whatever you want to call them. So you remove up to 80% of the existing or the original trees, leaving the very best trees. Now what the massive density does to start with is it trains the plants to do this, to grow up. So they train to go up because you want straight trees. If you look at the floor in here, what you will not see is any knots in the timber. This is the highest value wood. Wood is graded according to defects. So the best quality wood, particularly for structural, has no knots in it. So the other thing you do if you want to grow timber is you high prune. And this is up to 6 metres. Now by doing that, every time you lop a side branch off a tree, as it grows like a layer on an onion, the new growth has no knots in it. So those trees there are the highest value forestry or timber potential of any trees because they are not free timber, so it can be sold as veneer wood. And structurally it's the best, there's no defects, so it sells as the highest price. So by removing most of the weaker inferior trees, you save the fuel tank of moisture for these guys. And by removing the side branching, you get the best quality wood and you let light in. So you've drought-proofed it because only the plants you want are tapping into that water. And you've opened it up, so now you might have grazing underneath there. You might even, I've seen farms where they grow in the wintertime pumpkins underneath them. This was a poplar forest in the East Coast. Point is, it's called agroforestry. You combine agriculture and forestry. And when it's done well, it is seriously sexy. The other thing is, when you grow these trees and you keep the best quality trees, instead of getting someone like a Bunnings or one of the big timber merchants to come in, cut the trees down and take them, that's called stumpage. You just get the absolute minimum amount. But if you get into partnership with perhaps a timber merchant and you say, right, I have this quality timber of these species, what sort of specifications would you want? And they tell you what you want. Then you bring in your own portable sawmill, cut them down and slab them to the agreed specifications. Those trees can be worth up to $1,500 a cubic metre. Now it's the equivalent of, if you're growing olives and you then just send your olives or get someone in and they take them away, you get a small amount. But if you do your own stuff and you do your own marketing and come up with your own boutique product, suddenly that's where the real benefits are. So agroforestry, very exciting stuff. If you are passionate about this, there is a program called the Master Tree Growers course that's run a couple of times a year, and it's an intensive course designed for farmers and people like yourselves where you learn about the different species and how to grow them and how to design these systems so you get the best results. But the simplest thing you could do is be thinking, who's got a fireplace or a wood stove in the house? Yep, it gets pretty cold in these parts of the world. You could be in an area half the size of this basketball court, be growing enough timber for your fuel use at home. And you just manage them on a coppice rotation. There's some really good high energy, high value trees that have much greater fuel wood production potential. And you can grow those species. The point is there's so many different ways we can be growing trees onto our property. And when Australia gets its act together and starts to really embrace climate change and the need to offset carbon emissions, when you see a tree like this that's being hugged by this wonderful farmer, that's a store of carbon. And increasingly, we are going to be seeing research and funding potential for people to be growing trees to offset carbon emissions somewhere. So carbon farming, you may have heard of carbon farming, is going to increasingly, when we start to realise the real world, is going to start to become increasingly important for us. So that's worth having a look at as well. This is a agroforest. This is in Balingup, and these trees are only 18 months old. Already we've gone in, you can see the stumps, we've removed some of the weaker trees, and we start form pruning. If you know anything about growing plants, you prune them early. What's that?
What are they?
Those ones are called Botry saligna. It's a hybrid between Eucalyptus botryoides and a Eucalyptus saligna. So the other thing too, if you're going to grow timber trees, you don't just get any old tree. You go to a good farm tree nursery and say, I want your provenance varieties that have been bred for timber. Just like the apple that you eat has come from a tree that's been bred for hundreds of years, high value timber comes from trees that have been selected and bred for their particular qualities. And so go for provenance, that's a very important term. Again, Rachel will be able to point you in the direction. There's farm forestry trials that have been done. But the other thing is, by pruning the branches when they're the size of my finger is much better than trying to prune a branch that's that big, that's 3 metres in the air. That's when it's dangerous and extraordinarily exhaustive. But if you do your form pruning early, you can create fantastic timber. This is the pole saw. So you can see my mate Darren there. He's lopping the side branches off, getting those beautiful high-value timber trees. So it's there. Lots of good information is available, and I would strongly suggest you have a think about how some of these trees can be grown. We've been blessed with the best timber trees in the world. Eucalypts are the most widely planted tree in the world. Nothing comes close. Even pines are not as widely planted. When you look at them as a genus of plants, amazing.
What do you think of the mallee for the oil?
Okay, I was saying to Rachel before we started, for the want of $2 million, we have got the potential for the most extraordinary industry to not only revive the economic, but the agricultural and the sustainability or the environmental basis of our farms. I think the oil mallee industry is just one of the greatest opportunities that we have. So I think it's magnificent. Until the mid-80s, we were importing most of our eucalyptus oil into this country. From Swaziland, from Chile, from Brazil, South Africa. Madness. But, so it's just at that point where it needs that investment, that critical investment, so we can get a lot more of the distilleries out there and then get the biogeneration plants out there that can take the fuel stock. Okay, the one you've all been waiting for. Weeds. Okay, now I can absolutely guarantee that this property, which is on West Swan Road, was not sown to Patterson's curse. Can bet everything I own. So why does it look like a crop of beautiful purple flowers? And they're not Docker supporters, probably not.
Nobody cares.
Nobody cares, but something has happened to that soil. Why is it that that plant is now dominant?
It's probably like cattle or something.
And essentially we can say it's being mismanaged. Because nature, remember that 12th commandment? Thou shalt never leave the soil bare. So nature says, I don't want bare soil. I know how long it takes to produce good soil. I know how quickly it can be lost in a dust storm or a thunderstorm. So this is the only plant that can now thrive in those degraded soils. The more you degrade those soils, as I said, the old bell-shaped curve, it gets further and further away from being productive and less species can grow there. So the first thing I would be saying to this person is this year, if they said, "Hell, what do?" I'd say, there's not much you can do this year. Why is that? Big, ugly, bloody plant. Now, interestingly, this is often when people notice they've got a problem. The horse is so seriously bolted by this point. It's done 15 laps of the oval and come back for a feed and then gone out again. You have so missed the boat on this guy here. So the best thing that they could do at this point is soil manipulation, which is based on getting either a leaf tissue test that we talked about or the soil test. What's that going to tell me? Absolutely. Why is that plant dominating? Why? The question we just don't ask enough in this Western society is why. And the chances are, the answer is that the soil has become degraded, it's probably become acidic, and it's probably chronically deficient in a couple of trace elements. And guess what? The only plants that can thrive in those conditions are these guys or another weed. If you start to get the soil tests, manipulate based on those soil test results, you'll start to put the soil back into the middle of the bell-shaped curve. And for a start, now this guy has to compete with all the other species that were probably originally sown there. So when it comes to weeds, we need to think, I guess, holistically. And step number one is we have to identify our weeds. Now this is an older copy, and I'm sure Rachel has the newest copy. This is called Western Weeds. And it's a sadly, depressingly thick book, because this is all the weeds that are found in WA, and it keeps growing. But this is a fantastic book for identification. There's now wonderful apps. There's an app now that you can buy, which is called Weed App. And you can walk around in your paddock with the Weed App, and it's got pictures of the weeds at juvenile through to adolescent and mature. So you can, in the paddock, go, what the hell is this plant? Why do you want to see the weed at the different ages?
So you can identify it earlier.
Damn straight. This guy here, as a baby, looks nothing like it does a big, brutish, ugly adult. As a baby, it looks like comfrey. It's got these beautiful fat rosettes right at ground level. If you don't know that, then you've missed the best opportunity to control the bugger. So, step number one is identification. What the hell is it that you're dealing with? So, Rachel, these booklets, lots of information online can help you. Number two is we need to know the biology. Why do we want to know the biology of the plant?
We know the best way to kill it.
Damn straight. You've got to think like a warring general. You've got to know the weaknesses of your enemy. Is it the enemy to start with? When we do our property planning workshops, which is a one-day workshop, we encourage people to bring samples of plants that they think are a problem on their property, and the relief on people's faces when I say that's actually a native, that's mulla mulla, and you can see the relief. They go, oh, that's one less bastard plant to deal with. So for a start, it may not actually be a weed. It might be something that you can live with, but sometimes it's a big bad guy like this. So identifying the biology, you want to know whether it's an annual or a perennial. Does it have a bulb? Does it spread by runners or rhizomes? When does it flower? When does the sap flow down into the bulb if it is one? Because then you come up with a targeted strategy for control. In Australia, we spend over $4 billion a year controlling weeds. $4 billion a year. And that's not even human labour. So what I can say in relation to that is, whatever the weed it is, I can absolutely guarantee that somewhere, someone has come up with an extraordinary strategy for its control. All you need to do is to tap into that recipe, and as I said before, throw in your own healthy dollop of persistence. Because if someone says to you, oh, you just go out with your knapsack with your Roundup and you kill that and problem's gone, is that complete rubbish? Absolutely. Because this is the tip of a purple iceberg. Now, you'd mentioned it before, you get rid of one weed and you bring up a few others. There's a few reasons why that's a big problem, because for every year that this little bugger has been allowed to set its purple flowers, and Japanese and European tourists have been photographed in front of it, and da-da-da-da-da, every year it's been allowed to set seed, it's dumped more seed into that soil. There's a permaculture saying 1 year's worth of seeding is 7 years worth of weeding.
The only good thing about that stuff is it's got a high copper content, so it's good for room control and all stuff.
Indeed. Now, the interesting thing is that this is one of the few plants that can tolerate or can deal well with low copper levels. When you, with your soil test, find out that the copper levels are low and you start to address those imbalances, firstly, it disadvantages this guy and it puts the advantage back to the preferred species. So when you meet or talk to any organic farmers who have turned a farm around over years, what they will say anecdotally is, wow, some of the old species that used to be here start to make a reappearance because the soil has been moved back into the middle of the bell-shaped curve. It's more likely that this now has some competitors. At the moment, this guy's just having a free run. Okay, so the soil test, and that's where soil manipulation comes into the mix. So understanding the biology is critically important, and getting the right recipes for control. Rachel, whatever the particular weed you have, I guarantee that the Moore Catchment Council will have detailed species eradication strategies. Whatever the weed is, guaranteed. You do not have to reinvent the weed control strategy for whatever the weed is. Absolutely guarantee that. All you need to add is your persistence and sticking to the recipe. Now, this is one for blokes, because blokes will go, right, here's my weed, I'm going to talk about organic versus herbicide in a moment, but let's assume you've got your bottle of glyphosate, otherwise known as Roundup, and you read the instructions and it says 2%. 2%. What bullshit. I've got the worst bloody weed in the country. I know that it's bloody 5 times worse than that, so off you go and you dump in so much more because, you know, more is best, right, in this part of the world. If the TV was good this big, then surely when it's that big, it's even better. The problem is, particularly with Roundup, otherwise known as glyphosate, that's an isopropylene salt. What does a plant do when it sniffs salt? Does any plant like salt? It just goes, uh-oh, and shuts down. So you will burn the plant, and that gives you the illusion that you've killed the plant. You've just singed the top. Has it killed the plant? Absolutely not. So people will brag and go, oh man, it went brown within a couple of days. But the reality is, it grows back again. And you will hear people go, no, it doesn't work, the plant is resistant. No, you've just not dealt with it properly. So let's, for those of you who are passionate about organics, just do this for a little bit. And we'll talk about using herbicides effectively. Now, you'll see here that weed control is an integrated process. Herbicides are just one tool, if you need it at all. You don't have to use herbicides, but if you're going to use that tool, which has become very powerful and very popular, and some people will tell you it's the only way to control weeds, of course that's just not true. So if you're going to use herbicides, I'll give you some of the techniques now to use them effectively. Number one is, don't do the blokey thing that if it says 2%, then 20% is just going to be magnificent. You actually use less than the maximum amount. Remember, when it says a 2% solution, that's the maximum amount. And the chemical company wants you to buy more product. So they're going to, if it says 2%, then 1.5 or 1% is going to be effective. What you want to do is trick the plant into taking the herbicide. And herbicides are a poison. What do you want the plant to be doing when you give it the herbicide? When we say to people to kill off their verge lawn, everyone should kill their verge lawn. That's a good Australian thing to do. Kill the verge lawn and replace it with something else. What you do is the week before, you give it water and some fast-acting fertiliser. The only time we recommend that, because you want the thing to be growing actively, so then when you hit it with the herbicide at a sub-lethal dose, or it doesn't detect it, it basically absorbs the herbicide right through and you get an effective kill. So, make sure your plants are young and or actively growing. You can manipulate the plant to be actively growing. Love grass, for instance, and I'll show you a photo in a minute. How do you manipulate these grasses so that they're actively growing? Slash them, mow them, or burn them at the right time of the year. I stress that one. Burn at the right time of the year. The plant loves it, and it vigorously regrows. You've got so much less detritus to deal with. Bright, fresh, young growth. You need nowhere near as much herbicide because you've got rid of most of the sort of aging and not very active growth. You get these young, fresh sprigs. You need a lot less herbicide. You get a much better kill. So manipulate the plant to be young and or actively growing. Or if it's this bugger and someone says, how do I deal with this? Well, wait for the first breaking rains next year, because that's when that plant is regrowing as a new plant, and that's when you hit it. So the herbicides, use a smaller amount, less than the preferred amount. Make sure the plant's actively growing. For every litre of the mixture, put in a tablespoon of a wetting agent and a tablespoon of urea. Why? Into a mixture of a litre of the mixture would you add urea?
So the plant will absorb it.
They're nitrogen junkies. Just like we're sugar junkies, they're nitrogen junkies. They love nitrogen. So commercial spraying contractors add ammonium nitrate to their spray mixes. Urea, nitrogen. And what's the wetting agent going to do? Stickability. Now you can buy commercial penetrants and things like Pulse. They're designed to improve the efficacy of the spray. So you can add these to improve the effectiveness of your spray. Don't use dam water. Why do you only use the best quality water, particularly with knockdown herbicides like glyphosate? Because they're designed to bond to soil. So as soon as they hit the soil, they break down. I'm not saying that they're not still pollutants in the environment, but they're no longer an active herbicide. So you need to use the freshest quality water. And spraying generally, going right back to your question at the beginning, you seem to, who was it who asked, they have different times? Yeah. So generally speaking, we spray in the morning. Plants are actively photosynthesizing and moving the sugars around, generally once the sun comes up earlier in the morning. So that's the best time of the year, a day to spray. Okay, who prefers never to use herbicides, thinks Monsanto are a bunch of bastards, etc., etc. That's great. But the important thing is, you don't have to use herbicides, but going without chemicals doesn't mean you don't use weed control strategies. It just means you don't use herbicides. So we've got lots of different strategies. What I say to anyone who is very passionate about organic management, take heart. We, as a country, have the highest percentage of our agricultural commercial land under organic stewardship of any country in the world. How cool is that? That's very cool. So what it means is there are lots of commercial growers out there. They still have to deal with weeds, and they've come up with strategies to control those weeds without using herbicides. So go on and join Organic Growers Association. Any of those groups that are out there, go to their field days, talk to the people, find out how they use things like fire and steam. You can get commercial steam weeders, and they steam the weeds. It's like steaming your broccoli, and it works. I've tried it in different areas. There are lots of different techniques that don't revolve around using herbicides. And one of the most important with all of this is improving the soil. Because once you improve the soil, you give the advantage back to your preferred plants. This is very important too in relation to the herbicides, just going back again to the biology. If you have a plant with a bulb, what's an example of a weed with a bulb? Cape tulip, which we mentioned, onion or Guildford grass, Watsonia, gladioli, bad weeds. They are only taking they will only be taking sap down to the bulb when they're flowering. So that's when you hit them with herbicides. So you piggyback on that natural biological process. So that's when you hit the heart of the plant and you're more likely to have success. Same with arum lily. The weakness with arum lily is it's designed in a whorl shape. So if you just spray into the base of that plant, it actually draws the herbicide when it's flowering to the base of the plant. Has anyone dug an arum lily out? Man, it is the most extraordinarily productive plant. Pity you can't eat that bloody... I've dug out tubers this big. They are an extraordinary plant. So to kill that, you have to kill that massive energy store. So you spray into the base and it will be drawn down into the bulb. You spray at the right time of the year when it's flowering and you'll start to get success.
I found that the pigs are coming in even more.
Well, that's interesting. So it means that they're relatively edible then, those bulbs. Those yams. They're basically a yam. I wouldn't even call them a bulb.
I'm not so sure. The pigs are.
Okay. Well, yeah, if a pig eats them, they must have... anyway.
Still talking.
Now, I've had success with slashing at different times. I've had lots of success with slashing, but is that a good time of the year to slash and mow Patterson's curse? No. If you saw a time lapse or a close-up shot, you would just be spraying seed everywhere. So slashing and mowing has to be tempered with the reminder you don't do it when the plants are beginning to flower and set seed, because you'll just disperse the weed seed and that's what the plant wants. But that said, if you slash and mow most plants at least 5, 6 or 7 times a year, you will ultimately get rid of them. There's only one group of plants that loves to be repeatedly slashed and mowed. One group. What's that group of plants that loves being slashed and mowed? Grasses. The reason why we can have a cricket field out there or a football field is you keep mowing the grass and it says, right, I can't go up, so I go sideways. But all other plants that's put a lot of time and energy into producing a stalk with flowers and seed, they hate being mowed because it's just completely the opposite of what they want to have happen. So they have to keep using energy to do that. You keep mowing them and you will exhaust them. And the grasses take over. So if you want to have a good pasture, repeated slashing and mowing will transfer it from being weedy to good pasture. It's one of the most important tools. Paddocks become weedy if they're ex-farmland because people stop grazing and mowing and slashing them. That's when the weeds take over. But you revert it back to ongoing repeated slashing and mowing, keeping in mind that not doing it when the plants are flowering, and you will revert that back to being better pasture. Any questions about that?
It is, I believe, a crop you can just put into the ground that will turn it over to, is it nitrogen?
Okay, so that's called green manure cropping. Is a very powerful tool, and you'll see that I've talked about slashing and mowing here, combined with soil manipulation. So a green manure crop are fast-growing plants that we grow, and they're designed to feed the soil. It's an age-old technique, and it's fabulous. So you might say, if I wanted to turn this, and the key is with weed control, it's step 1 of a 3-step process. Step 1, find out everything you can about that weed, as I said. Know its biology, know the recipe for control. Step number 1, so you know what you're dealing with and how to strike. Number 2 is to basically think, what am I going to replace that weed with? What are you going to do then? There's no point just controlling that weed if you don't know what you're going to replace it with. Because all that happens if you just keep controlling weeds is what?
They just keep coming back.
They just keep coming back, and you make money for chemical companies, which personally I don't think is the greatest thing we can be doing. But if you say, I want to replace it with pasture or a timber crop or my macadamia orchard, then the third step is remembering that because of the fact that this is just the tip of the iceberg, it's going to take persistence. 2, maybe 3 or 4, 5 years to thoroughly say, I've got rid of that weed from that paddock. Has anyone had that success where they've taken a weedy paddock and replaced it with their preferred system? It takes time, doesn't it? And that's the most important technique. I want you to not think you have to use herbicides. You can use them, but you don't have to. And whenever I've seen people have success replacing weeds with something else, it's persistence. That's the common theme. So keep doing whatever it is you're doing, armed with the right information. So these are all different techniques that you can use. But the most important thing is persist and replace.
Does the same apply to double G?
Absolutely. Interestingly, we did a workshop up at Goomalling, and they said, the golf course is riddled with double Gs. How do we get rid of it? And we said, well, how do they drive around? Oh, they sit on their bloody buggies. And I said, well, until you stop that, Double G and Caltrop were waiting for humans to invent tyres and thongs, because it's just the best way to move these buggers around. So until they deal with the biology, which is this plant loves to be dispersed by tyres, and you're not going to get on top of the problem. So they really need to not play golf there for 12 months and then go in and actually pick up all of, or have a serious quarantining process where every golfer has to go and remove all the picked up spikes from their, just to have a serious quarantining system. So if you have Double G or Caltrop, does anyone have that? So you quarantine that area. So you put flags around it, bunting, whatever you want, and you know that that is the area you never drive across, and you go in with disposable thongs and you walk around like this, get the whole family doing it, and then you scrape those out and you do that for days on end and just pick up all of those spikes, dump them, burn them, whatever, because until you do that, that bugger is just going to spread.
Well, we've got a 15 to 20 acre paddock.
Right.
We grow our hay.
Okay, and it's got
We
the...
put the crop in, and the first year we've suddenly found double G's all over that paddock.
Okay, now did everyone hear that? And it's a big plug for making sure that you quarantine your whole property. Now, quarantining is assuming that everything and everyone wants to compromise your weed-free status. So, when you are bringing a contractor onto the property, on the phone you say, I assume you clean your machine and the equipment before you come onto a new property. And if they laugh at you or go, what the hell does that mean? They're probably not the person for you. So probably what's happened is, if you brought a contractor in to do that, they've just had some double G's onto their tyres. So I say to people, when a machine comes onto your property, before it comes onto the property, you go out and you run your hands over the tyres. If you get a sharp pain in the fingers, that was the double G trying to hitch a ride onto your property. So that's how it got me. We got Doc on our farm. We used to import hay for the horses. We used to hay the horses in the paddock. I remember as a boy opening up and putting the biscuits out for the horses. There'd be these stiff rust-coloured stalks in there. And as a boy, I didn't know what the hell it was, but I went, this doesn't seem right. Why is that in there? I knew the horses would need it. And sure enough, we now have Doc on the property because of that. So that's the other one. Meadow hay in WA is often a euphemism for crap that's bundled up that some mug will buy. Be very, very, very careful about meadow hay that you buy, because it's often filled with weeds.
Is it likely that that double G was introduced through the seed? Because I buy good seed. Well, I think it's good seed.
That's a great question. There's only a couple of really good seed merchants that I'd recommend. Hunter is one, or Irwin, and of course Simon Seeds, SYMMONDS. Should be fine if you get from those guys.
Well, I buy through Landcare.
Should be all right. I would have been very surprised.
We've been growing it for hay for years, but never had.
But you bought a contractor sowed it for you?
No, we do our own putting in, but we just get a contractor to cut and bale.
I would say the contractor brought it in on his machinery. And so the seeds came in, they sat there dormant, and then the next year with the rains. I would say that's invariably how it happens. So the number one way, there's three ways weeds come onto your property. One is seed dispersal, blowing in. Number two is coming in hay, particularly. And number three is on the tyres, or disease just because of bad soil that's hitched a ride on machinery. Quarantining is so important. So what you're going to need to do is probably go and do some very careful spot spraying, and maybe going in with a broad leaf herbicide if you have to, and going over the top and just knocking out that bugger.
So we can't put sheep in there?
I'd be wary of doing that. I'd be trying as much as possible to go out there and, taking an army of your friends and going and just repeatedly going, because once that bugger gets hold, it's just going to really make life difficult for the rest of the property. Any more questions about the weeds?
Is the beetle for the Patterson's curse readily available?
That's a great question, and it's been one of the success stories, has been how the Patterson's curse is finally in retreat in certain areas. Short answer is it available? As far as I know, if you talk to the Ag Department, God bless them, who've been butchered in terms of their budget and hence their staff, they won't have the officers now going and doing it. If you see an area where they are degraded, I would be actively digging out, grabbing as many of those plants and putting them onto your property very carefully, because then you will import it onto your place. You could talk with Rachel and just see if Moore Catchment Council is actively involved in any of that stuff. This is a very powerful tool for you as well. Southern weeds and their control. If you wanted to get one little book to help you with weed control, this is a corker. It's an Ag Department publication, and it's about $30, and it's got the major weeds, photos, young, adult, and most importantly, biological and chemical control strategies. Very cool. It's designed to go in the glove box, so it's just a great little tool to help you. So you're armed with good advice. So that's called Southern Weeds and Their Control. Rachel will probably have in their offices a weed herbarium and very good detailed information on weed control. So just to summarise with the weeds, there is so much information out there. This is a great booklet as well. I mean, look at this one. Very detailed information on weed control. Very good. Case studies for the major weeds. Trick is, as I said, make that information known yourself, follow the recipes and persist, and you can get rid of weeds. Any questions about that?
Up in Geraldton, every year they have what they call the WG Festival.
Yep.
And people collect as many WG seeds and they win prizes. And I think the WGs have actually decreased around the town because of that. So not getting as many in every year.
It's wonderful. And that's
an amazing...
It's such a simple thing to do, and it's so powerful. And we used to have, and Rachel will probably have some weed posters. And we say, take them out, put them up in your local sporting area or the supermarket, because until people know what these weeds are, they don't really understand how important it is. If you see it growing for the first time on the roadside, pull over and grab the basket and rip it out. So if you see a bright green, beautiful looking, pretty plant growing on the roadside with tiny little fern-like leaves and bright yellow flowers, that's caltrop. Get the basket out of that area, because if you don't, it will be sure as hell. Next year, like clockwork, the shire contractors will come and slash along there, and it will be spread another 200 or 300 metres.
Whatever you do, on the road to middle of the lawn, don't stop in with the old historic gardens, because the contract there is ridiculous. And we get into the shire and told them about it, because all tourists will stop there, and they said, we don't do anything.
You know, the folly, and I won't go on a tangent, but the folly of governments cutting back on R&D and research. Queensland, just one example. They used to have, like we do, a free pest and disease service. People could ring up, and some moron pointy head said, oh, that's costing us too much money. So they shut it down. They now have red imported fire ant. Does anyone know what this is? This is an awful. It's an aggressive ant. It attacks people. And there was one person who kept ringing up going, I'm sure we got red imported fire ant. Because they didn't have a free service anymore, it was 8 years before finally an officer went out and went, oh my God, it is. 8 years too late. So they now have a problem that is probably $300 or $400 million to control. Simply because they tried to save $1 million a year on cutting back on an essential government service. I'm getting political, but if you know anyone who has any opportunities to influence government, say, for God's sake, you put the money and the time and the energy into land management, research and management, because until you do, we will just have all these problems biting us on the bum. Yes? Hallelujah. I think kind of think you would be listening to all of this, and it's so awesome that you're here, and it says a lot about your commitment to the area, so that is very cool. So please pass that on. That is such an important tool that we manage our areas effectively. John?
Just could make a suggestion.
Yes.
Start at the top and work down. Try and influence from the bottom up.
Are you talking about politicians or weeds? Or weeds?
Stand on hands and kick heads.
Yes.
From the top down, don't try and work from the bottom up.
Look, absolutely. I was lucky enough to be giving a talk at Garden Week, and Colin Barnett just happened to be walking past. I had a headset, so I was able to launch it. He just decided to axe the Swan River Trust, so it was a great chance to get some things in his ear and to politely, but just say, you know, we need this very essentially and really important government agency. So yeah, I hear you. One thing which leads to one thing I didn't say, there's some very important tools or laws for managing weeds, which has come out of the baptism of fire of bush regeneration experts. And they will say, number one is you start controlling weeds at their weakest. Interestingly, blokes would say, right, I'm going to fight nature, and they jump in the middle of this with their brush cutter or their knapsack. Is that the best way to control those weeds? You start on the front, where the thing is moving, where the prevailing winds are pushing it, and you peg it back that way. Number two is you never control physically control more weeds than you can replace in the 1 year. Now that's not to say you don't stop this guy from seeding, but you don't actively remove and get it ready for planting more than you can replace in the 1 year, because the weed will just take over and that's expensive. And number 3 is minimise soil disturbance. So one of the problems is contractors will come out and they'll say, yeah, we rotary hoe the soil. Now rotary hoeing is, I believe, a dinosaur process, because when you turn the soil over, guess what you do? You disturb and bring to life the weed seeds. Most of the time, particularly for pasture, you use a direct drill or a machine that has tines that's designed to slice through and just minimise disturbance, so you can sneak your weed, your preferred seed in, and try and keep the weed seed slumbering. And then you grow your crops over the top and you haven't brought the other stuff to life. Does that make sense? So minimising disturbance. So things like slashing and mowing, where you're not turning the soil over. Ploughing this would not solve the problem, and yet you'll hear people go out there and plough. It's not the best way to control those weeds.
What's the degree on the...
Oh, right, well that's Watsonia, and this was bought as a slide similar to what you were saying about Geraldton. This was at Fairbridge, and the students that went there, they had challenges. And the one that could bring in the biggest amount of the bulbs with the corm at the bottom got a big bucket of lollies. When they brought them in and they left the bulb in the ground, they lost points because they weren't controlling them. So this became an activity for the kids. They get lollies and it became competitive. And they're the sorts of things, I know people who've paid their grandkids 5 cents for every snail they bring off the veggies, or you give them nets to go and get the white caterpillar moths. There's different ways you can be innovative to try and get success. This one just very quickly shows, this was kikuyu, rampaging across the landscape. We burnt it at the right time of the year. Look at the new green sprigs coming up. That is going to be so receptive to smaller amounts of targeted herbicide to get success. And this is just to remind us that if you know what you're looking for, the landscape is full of clues as to what's going on. What's that plant there on the right? Barley grass. Barley grass is an indicator of an absolute minimum waterlogging and probably the beginnings of salt. Now, if you didn't know any better, you go, wow, that looks beautiful, what a gorgeous looking plant. But you should be able to say, this is telling me something is not quite right with this landscape, and I need to make those changes. Okay, we'll move on to fire now, fire safety. So, everyone hopefully is concerned about the threats of fire. It's a big issue. We need to be thinking about this. The most important thing to remember is the design of the property. Now, this was a place we were working on in Bakers Hill. So we did beautiful, wide, sexy shelter belts, but we designed it so that this fire emergency vehicle access track was designed so that it was a circuit, number one. Number two, that you could think and could drive a small truck on it at any time of the year. Now, if your fire breaks, as you call them, you know you could confidently drive a small truck on there at any time of the year, then they're going to work for you. So they should be at least 3 to 4 metres wide and 3 to 4 metres high. Because what you're trying to design them to ensure is a fire tender can drive along there. But if you've planted your plants too close, if you're doing planting and they're now moving into the actual area that's designed as that corridor for a vehicle, it's no longer safe, it's no longer to be functional. The other thing is too, if you get, and I stress, if you get approval from your fire control officer, you can have a variation to not have bare earth fire breaks. Who has the bare earth fire breaks on their property? Who thinks that just seems like a bloody waste of time? Yeah. Now the important thing is the fire control officers know that, but they assume that it's better to get everyone doing a poorer quality job than having some people with nothing at all. But if you can go in with a farm plan and show them that you know what you're talking about, that you know it's not a level 10 force field. I've seen properties where this is the boundary, and there's the road, there's the bare earth fire break, 3 metres, and then it is a sea of veld grass up to the house. Now that person, consciously or otherwise, assumes that fire break is a level 10 force field. Why else would you just allow the rest of it to be a terrible weed fest? So, in this property here, we left 6 metres from the fence line before we planted. So we knew that our shrubs along here were never going to impede on this area. Now, you can go to your fire control officer, every shire has them, be very nice to them, take your plan in and say, I think I'm worthy of having a variation, which is a slashed, mown or a chemical fire break. Because if you keep it slashed or mown, firstly, it's much lower as a fire risk, but a boggy fire break, which is the bare earth fire break, is actually really difficult for a fire tender to drive up. It might be carrying 4 tonnes of water on it. Boggy soil is not good for them. They would prefer to have a hard, compacted, low mown or slashed fire break. But the trick is getting someone to be able to do that and manage it well is not easy. So if you can go in and prove that you know what you're doing, you've designed your whole property to reduce the risk of fire, they're more likely to give you an annual variation. The same with hilly properties. Who's got a property on a hill? And what happens with a bare area fire break? It gets rutted. They know these things, but again, unless you can prove you know what you're doing, they're very loath to give you permission to have a slashed, mown or chemical fire break. The other thing I say is every part of your property should have at least 4 or 5 uses. Everything. So that means this should not just be a boggy, ugly patch that you never use. Turn it into the area that you walk with the dogs, or you ride the horse after you've been riding it. You make it a circuit around your property so it's multi-purpose. That guarantees it's going to be used effectively and designed so that you can use it, God forbid, if it needs to be used as a fire emergency vehicle access point. Finally, I think we all have a moral responsibility to ensure that we keep our properties safe so that if a fire crew do come to protect our property, we are minimising risk to them. Now, could you think of anything worse to do on a sticking hot day than go and fight a fire? These men and women are just legends and they're heroes and we need to support them. So that means keep it as a circuit. So if you have gates, they're not locked, and it needs to be a circuit. Square edges on fire breaks are actually really difficult to move a heavy fire tender through. So design it as a circuit so it's following your boundaries, but it should be a circuit. If it's not a circuit, it's not going to work, and you could have them trapped in an area, and firefighters have died because they got trapped in an area they couldn't get out of. The other thing, who's got sheds? This is blokes again, blokes and sheds. You need to, I believe, on the side of your shed, list the chemicals that are in that shed. Because if the fire is coming through your property, the radiant heat is often enough to create, to turn those things that are stored into your sheds into bombs that they ignite and cause problems. In the summertime, move any chemicals. This is diesel, oil, paint, at least 1 metre in from the shed wall, and cover them in something like an insulation blanket. Why is that? Keep them cool. And the radiant heat can be enough to burst them into flames. Again, people have died because the sheds just exploded. The other thing is, please never, ever, ever get artificial turf on your property. Now, it sounds like a bit of a joke, but we know people have said, I've run out of water, so I'll put in artificial turf. Now, artificial turf, for people like yourselves who love the land, is a little bit like looking for love with a blow-up doll. You can make it look as real as you like, but it ain't real. I've seen artificial turf. They even put brown flecks in it to make it look like there's little bits of dead sward in it. Now, all jokes aside, this stuff is plastic. So what does plastic do when it gets hot? It off-gasses. And you now have big issues with plumes of toxic stuff that these poor old firefighters and firemen and women have to deal with. Artificial turf, bad news. Okay, let's talk about the design of your property. And to do that, I will go to the next bit, which is the final bit, if you can indulge me for a little bit longer. Okay, here we go. Okay, so getting back to our good friend John Citizen, I'm going to wrap everything up by talking about the design of your property. The overall holistic design. So there's John, that's the photo that you've seen before. And the other thing that I say is, I'll talk about this in relation to fire safety. So there's the property. Now, the most important thing we need to remember about the farm is that if we do a property design for the property, that is our best chance of having something we can move forward with confidence. Okay, so we do property planning workshops, and we often do them in partnership with groups like Moore Catchment Council, and we call it speed date farm planning. And over the course of one day, we help you come up with a design for your property. Big farmers do it over often 3 or 4 days, spread over a couple of weeks, but you can get away with one day because you're smaller properties. So this is what we do over the course of the day. You obviously have a range of information, and Rachel can come up with all of this, have your beautiful aerial photos with all that stuff. Why do we put the north point on our aerial photo? Why on earth is that there? Making sense of where you live. So the prevailing winds, the sun, etc. When you start to know what is influencing your property, you now have the knowledge and hence the power to be able to slow down or snuff out the things you don't want and harness and enhance the things that you do want. So when we look at our property here, the first part of what we do over the course of a farm plan is we put in the baseline info. So we say to people, put down the things that are already there on your property. Existing problems, waterlogging, salt skulls, rocky outcrops, weed patches, whatever other issues you want help with. And then, as we said before, the dreaded prevailing winds. We're the windiest. Chicago, Wellington and the southwest of WA vie for the windiest part of the planet. So we have prevailing winds here that are pretty awesome. And people think the easterly is the issue. No, it's east, northeast and southeast. It's that entire arc of hot, dry winds. Then we have, when it gets cold, and it does get cold, the northwesters, the cold fronts, and the southerly that blows right up the kilt. That's not much fun. And then when you guys are lucky enough to get it, every now and then you get the sea breeze, which is cooling. But these different winds are going to have a big impact. So if this is my neighbour's property here and they think that purple bush is just the most extraordinary crop, what's going to happen on my place is that prevailing wind is going to blow it across. If I now have a pine plantation or big fuel loads here, where's the major fire risk? Those hot, dry winds. And what's the most important part of this property to protect? That area there. And we'll talk about that in a sec. But the important thing is, once you know this and the angles of the sun and how it changes, you can start to make sense of where you live and put in some really important tools to make a difference. Then the next thing, which is quite difficult for the John citizens of this world to recognise, is this piece of land is actually 5, 6 or 7 totally different types of land, all together, as the different pieces in the puzzle. So, who can tell me the different types of land on this property?
Stream area?
So the stream area, we've got the bush areas. Now the key is with this, by identifying them as different, we're saying that they have their own unique management requirements. Now only certain parts of this land are suited to being grazed with sheep, but John's assumed it's all eligible for sheep grazing, and guess what? The whole place goes down, it degrades. So by understanding there are different types of land, we can start to make sense. And so as you mentioned, we have the creek lines, but also the riparian. That's a fancy way of saying it gets waterlogged on a wet year. Then we have the open paddocks. Now they're not all the same either. We have what we call winter-spring grazing areas. Okay, this will test your landcare skill and understanding. What areas are winter-spring grazing? What type of land would that be? Well spotted. So the winter-spring means the best time of the year to graze them is winter and spring. So that's going to be the areas that dry out first. So the gravels, the more sandy ridges, etc. Then you have, obviously, the other areas which are the summer autumn. And they're those paddocks. I just get so sad when I see cows standing in boggy paddocks. It's not only bad for those animals, but guess what it's doing to that land? It's destroying it. The best thing you can do with those low-lying, heavier clay properties is rest them for winter and spring. Don't let anything on there, because if you rest them at that time of the year, they will reward you with the most amazing production over the summer and the autumn. So you make that differentiation between them. Okay, and then things like rocky outcrops. Anyone got some shallow, rockier soils? And they're lousy often for cropping and grazing, but they can have a wonderful role at doing something else. But until you understand those differences, and then finally, the fire safe zone. The red dot special. There's the house. 30 to 40 metres around your house should be designed as the fire safe zone. So you design everything in there, you vet and screen to minimise the risk of fire. A fire can sweep through here, and that's, you know, bit of a bummer, but things will regrow. But if a fire goes through there, we know what can happen. It can kill people. It can totally devastate lives. So that part you never ever want to have fire going through. So you design the whole property. All right, looks like a Jackson Pollock special, but that's just now getting you to understand the different types of land. And your property, if you do that same process, probably 5 to 7 different types of land as well. So the next bit, with all apologies to vet nurses, we call this next bit the green dream. And the green dream is what you euthanize animals with. So some people go, oh no, you can't call it the green dream. But this is the vision of what you want your property to look like. So step number 1 is, once you know your land is actually not made up of human straight lines, you know that your fencing needs to change. And that's why someone invented electric fencing. Has anyone used electric fencing? It's great stuff. I had 30 odd horses on my place and they were all scared shitless of the white flapping tape. So I could fence off some orchids here and have them grazing there. And I could use it in weird and wonderful shapes so that I could have my animals where I wanted them, not where they wanted to be. Because chances are they didn't know as much about land management as I did. So I can fence off my creek lines, my waterways, my bushland. But fencing off is not enough, is it? If you fence off your bushland and it was weedy, guess what's going to happen? It's going to get weedier. You then need to intervene and control the weeds and put back your preferred species. So that's just the beginning of the process. But it allows you to make sense. So if John Citizen did this, his landscape would start to heal. And the bush regeneration, as we said, is all about knowing the weeds, controlling them, talking to someone like Rachel, finding out what species would grow there, what are the best weed control strategies. There may even be some funding. The best chance of getting government and state funding to help you is if you are going to protect bushland and waterways. That's the two most important tools and funding opportunities that are there. There's lots of field days maybe for pasture and timber cropping, etc. But real funding, more likely to get it if it is protecting waterways and bushland. Is that right, Rach? Okay, then I talked about the green frameworks, the most important thing on your property, but they are different designs for different areas. So where we have perceived the risk of fire to be high, we use species that have minimum fire flammability. We choose species that are designed so we know the prevailing winds and we choose the right species. Now this area here, even though you get prevailing winds, is there a high fuel load through here? Given that John probably flogs the hell out of the property, the one good thing about that is there's probably very little fuel load. So this is a low risk. This, on the other hand, bad news. Why is that? Because we've got fuel load and a hot, dry wind. So this area, I know if this is my place, I have to armour this area from the worst effects of fire. This is more likely than not the area the fire would come from. Okay, so other areas where there's less risk of fire, I might put in timber species. Fire flammable, but I put them in an area where that's not an issue. Then, of course, we would have our gorgeous native vegetation, locally endemic species, so we can get shagging bandicoots on the property, betons and echidnas moving through, and that is the wow factor when you start to see that. I've seen the most crusty farmers almost get teary in the eye when they see animals coming back that they remember seeing on the farm when they were kids. It's just one of the great joys for them to know the land is healing and regenerating. Fodder systems, if you wanted them. And then our wetlands. We might have a boggy paddock and we might want to put in an artificial wetland or do our creek line revegetation. We could put in some high value timber in certain areas, and they could be everything from blackwoods to cork oaks to beautiful wandus and jam wattles. There's so many fantastic species. Our perennial pastures, forgive the spelling. And again, we break it up according to the different areas that we had. Tree crops, as we said, you can be starting to think of cork oaks, carobs, honey locusts, macadamias, sandalwoods, brushwood. We have so many amazing species. Now that might seem a bit intimidating, but what that is your vision. That's the page on the cookbook where you go, that's going to sit in the dunny door where most people do their best creative thinking. You have it, the family looks at it, you go, right, what are we going to do this year? What's on the agenda for 2014? All right, we're going to put in that windbreak. So we talk to Rachel, find out what are the species. We know the soil type, we find out and we get the right recipe. And I believe this should be augmented with a Landcare calendar. Every fridge that is owned by a farmer or a small landholder should have on the fridge the Landcare calendar. So when you go to get the milk out, it says for every month there's something you should be doing. Because if you don't know the right time of the year to do something, chances are it won't be something you proactively manage, it'll be something you have to reactively deal with. Case in point, the Patterson's curse. If that person in the previous slide knew that come the first breaking rains, that's the time to go and hit the bastard. When they went to got the milk out, they went, that's right, I've got to go out there and either get a contractor in or I have to deal with it myself. And if I want to put in that windbreak, there's actually 5 or 6 steps to get that planting successful, and they start months in advance. You don't in June go, oh, that's right, I wanted to plant some trees, and badger someone like Rachel and go, yeah, I wanted to put some plants in, I haven't done any weed control, I don't know what that's just not going to work. But if the calendar's on the fridge, 6-8 months before, you start finding out who's going to fence off that area, start the weed control the year before, beat back the weed seed burden, order the species, get everything lined up so that it becomes a sequence and you follow those recipes. Does that make sense? Okay. I've pretty much finished now. I just wanted to do a couple of ads. Now, you have, as we said before...
I'll just interrupt.
Yes, you can.
Have you got a website where you can get an up-to-date aerial view?
Okay, not me personally, but the aerial photos, it's very easy to get hold of those. You can go online yourself to Near Maps.
Okay,
Now, Rachel will... It looks like Rachel, through the Moore Catchment Council, has got the latest software, so she will have access to aerial photos.
I know we tried this once before.
Yeah,
we never got them. We must
find
couldn't find them.
Have a chat with Rach. She certainly... Do you want to say something about the aerial photos and how people...
Yeah, and I know we did go to one of the shows here and tried it a couple of years ago, and nothing happened. Okay. Can't remember now. Just, yeah.
It's actually... So have a chat with Rach, and as a plug. Now, I don't get paid to say this, but I've always said whoever is the Catchment Council or Landcare hub in your area, that is gold. Because those people firstly have the experience and the contacts and the networks, they often have access to funding, and they have skills and expertise. You just would be crazy not to take advantage of the skills and support they have.
There is currently a program with Moore Catchment.
Yes.
And we've got this for refurbishing shrubbery and for fencing off when the bush, etc.
It's beautiful. It's just such a powerful tool. Anyone who's had success on their farm, I guarantee that they have linked in strongly with their catchment group. It's just such a wonderful way to get the funding and the support to make a difference. So you will be able to get access to this very funky, small landholder guide. So that's got lots of information in there as well. If you're interested, coming up soon, it's been 6 years in the making. I've just about finished a Heavenly Hectares book. So it's all been written. We're just getting the graphics and everything done. If you are interested in finding or getting about the book, please use your pen and put your details on there and we'll let you know. And we believe it will complement these local reference books that are there. But the tools and the information is out there to help you. Any questions before I finish up? Yes.
If we're giving you feedback forms and you've got
Yes.
all our details, can we just write on there info about the book?
Yeah, you can do that. And
You do
I'm
that.
assuming Rachel's happy for us to get access to that information and let people know. And through our website, so our website is the Forever Project, and we have a whole suite of workshops that we do. And a lot of them are gardening-based as well. And our team includes the great Sabrina Hahn and Steve Wood, hopefully people you know if you're into gardening. And we're very blessed and honoured to have them as part of our team. So we run lots of different workshops. So just Google the Forever Project and you'll see all the different workshops that we have, including these style. And as I said before, if anyone is interested, we've got these Pasture field days coming up. And that will be a great way for you to get detailed information about pastures, etc. Yeah, you certainly can.
I don't know if you've got any time, but any suggestions about rabbit management?
Sorry, and I didn't talk about those. Okay, things like rabbits. Number one, if you have the size of area, you need to have a minimum of 5 acres. You can get a baiting license to do baiting. Now, one of the things that can be done sometimes is a coordinated approach, and I'm looking at Rach. Is there a coordinated baiting program? Okay, so how big's your property? 48. So you should be able, you've got no problems with being able to bait rabbits. It's when you're less than 5 acres and close to towns, they get a bit antsy about baiting.
So is the bait something like pindone or?
Okay, there's two different types of bait. Pindone is the one there's an antidote to. So generally in areas where there's the risk of domestic animals being hit, you use pindone. I personally prefer to use 1080 because pindone will kill all sorts of other animals as well. So if a bandicoot eats that grain, they will die as well. There is an antidote, it's vitamin K1, so you can get them treated. 1080 there's no antidote, but as you probably famously know, it really only hits feral species. So I would be saying go with 1081 shot, which is the standard. If you have lots of rabbits, it's worth as well. If you're going to go into this, then rip the warrens as well. Fumigate and rip the warrens if you know where they are.
The house might be on top of
It sounds very much like a baiting program. The other thing is guards for trees is a good idea, but remember the plastic bag guards get very hot. So unless your plant is well above those bags, use wire guards instead of plastic. And those
at the moment, we're not
Personally, I think baiting is the right way to go, just to get the number, because they will just continue to breed and cause problems.
Yeah.
There are some deterrents as well for kangaroos. Anything that we would call a vegan, which is your rabbits and kangaroos, they're vegans. You know, vegan doesn't even cover it. So for those guys, which means from a biological point of view, they hate anything that is associated with meat or rotting meat. So I've used different strategies. We used to use an egg mix. So you get eggs, mix them up, leave that to fester for 2 or 3 days, then put that in a spray can with some white paint, acrylic paint, and then spray that over your plants lightly. The smell is enough to deter even possums and even black poppies. Okay, other things you can do, rabbits. I get blood and bone, let it get wet so it starts to just get the maggots breeding in it, and you smear that on the inside of your guards. Guarantee no rabbit or kangaroo will go near that because of that smell. And change the smell. So fish or seaweed at different times. The worst time that you'll have with rabbits and kangaroos is January to March. The food is really, and they're hungry and they're starving and they're desperate. So you need to up your deterrence at that stage and change the smell, because desperation will say, I've smelt that for a while, there's no human or predator associated, so I'll risk it. But if you keep changing the smell and the guards, that should be enough. And there are also species lists of species that are less prone to rabbit and kangaroo predation.
Yes.
So things like some of the banksias, melaleucas, some of those species are less likely to be targeted. So with all of these things, it's a suite of strategies together, you've got the best chance of success.
Does Agro actually protect kangaroos?
Agro? I've heard that. I've heard a range of different things. Oh, wow, I haven't heard that one for a while. I have heard that Agro does deter them. How success?
It's a wetting agent.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a wetting agent. I've also heard where water bombers have gone, that in the following year where they've dropped, you get massive regeneration, and they're not sure whether it's the wetting agent effect or it deters the grazing animals. So yeah, Agro is worth a try.
One question on your wetting agents. I
Yes.
believe most of the product in wetting agent is detergent.
It's a commercial industrial detergent, and the reason I say that is we get people at workshops going, oh well, then I'll just put the Morning Fresh out there, which is actually a completely inferior wetting agent, and it's much more expensive and it doesn't last as long. So it's a surfactant, but it's an industrial strength
I
product.
have put some on my lawn at my place, and I just consider it a total investment wasted.
Oh, what, the wetting agent?
Yeah.
So did you activate it?
Yeah, I was putting it on there. I didn't hand water.
And that's the trick. You've got to activate it. So we say to people, if you're going to go to the effort of putting the wetting agent on, get the high pressure hose. It should look like your soil has developed rabies because you've activated it. And you might find some areas you need to do 2 or 3 hits to really break through the water repellency, but there's no doubt they work. But the soil amendments that I mentioned before, the clays, if you can integrate those into the soil, you will permanently remove most of the problems of water repellency. So that's worth keeping in mind too. The wetting agents are good, but they're a ongoing thing you have to do each year.
Yeah, the other big one was on the subject of using bentonite clay. It's not so I've used it on my veggies and
Yep.
trees and that.
Yep.
The use of zeolite.
Yeah.
Most
So
of this comes from
Peter Cochran?
Yes.
Yeah. So the best soil amendments are a mix of the bentonite or kaolinite clay, good clean clay, zeolite and spongelite. That's the holy trinity if you can get to 3.
So I just use the rotary hose for the mix of oil and soil.
It's the sexiest thing to do. If you can do it well, it's the foundation. And think of it as turning your fuel tank from a Morris Minor to a Bugatti size. You know, you are just significantly improving the ability to hold and store water. So I use 3, zeolite, spongelite and bentonite or kaolinite clay. Generally at the rate of about, if you've got really shitty, horrible grey sands, 5 to 7 kilograms per square metre into that depth. If you've got more yellowy sands and they already form into bundies, probably no more than 2 kilograms per square metre. But mix it in. Don't leave it on the soil surface. That clay on the surface will go like toothpaste if it's wet before it's mixed in. Okay, so your best bet is the LABC. I actually believe that, which is the lime amended bioclay for commercial amounts. And that has got significant amounts of nutrients. That's all our sewage. It is available, but in limited areas. But come along, and the aim is within the next few months, it's going to be widely available.
So with the fact that you can put that rose
Yeah.
if you put it on, but don't get it to that foaming stage, is it basically not activated yet? Or
Exactly.
it's just not?
It's not as activated. You need a really good downpour to get it to really activate.
So if we put it on through 2 weeks ago or something like that, is it worth giving it a really solid?
Yeah. So go out. I say to everyone, and I don't work for a company that sells the stuff, but I reckon everyone should have their own firefighting equipment. So whether that's a 1,000-litre tank with your own independent pump, so you can use that for firefighting, but also nice frothing water. So when you do your tree planting, whatever, you can go and get it to activate. So a couple of things just before I finish with the fire safe zone around your home. Look at the fire retardant species lists, and I have a species list. Do you, Rach? Do you have a? So I can send you a fire retardant species list, and that will be in our book into the future. FESA are loath to do it because of defects, because lawyers and government say don't put species on there that are fire retardant, because if the house burns down, we can get sued. But if you're sensible and you manage weeds under them, there are some species that should go in there. I also say in that fire safe zone around the home, that's the place for the veggies and the fruit trees, both of which need a lot more management, so they should be closer to the home, so you get better results. But as well, they're more likely to be fire retardant components. If you're in a high fire risk area, if you're surrounded by beautiful bushland, has lots of, okay. I would not use street tree pruning mulch in that fire safe zone around the house. I'd use stone and gravel. You just minimise, don't use straw, in your veggie gardens. You just need to think the risk of fire is high. It's the spotting end that you're worried about. If you have beautiful remnant trees in that area, I don't recommend getting rid of them, but I recommend putting underneath them things like stone or gravel, or something like native pig face, which is a beautiful ground cover and totally fire retardant. And any leaf litter that's falling, you're picking it up. In that 20 to 30 metre area, you just have to be a Nazi and just be keeping those fuel loads down. Doesn't mean you clear everything and put green concrete, but you're just a bit sensible. No artificial turf, small areas of turf are great. Don't have the fuel, don't have the hay stored, or the wood for the stove stored in that area as well. Go for things like brass fittings on the outside. Why do you want brass fittings for your taps, etc.? No, it's obvious that if you are there and you survive the fire, most houses burn down once the fire front's gone through. Unless it's a mega fire, God forbid we don't have those. Most fires, the fire front and the embers are lodged, you're not there, and that slowly burns the house down.
If you have a ball, you probably need it sometime to get a genset. So.
Yeah, so you have your own independent firefighting. So good brass fittings, at least one fireproof hose. So just taking the hose over hot areas, you're going to burn the hose and suddenly you can't take the water. Simple things like that. Everyone should have the DFES, or what was the FESA booklet. Everyone's got that. Great information. Just follow that as well. Okay, I'm well and truly out of time. I apologise. Rachel's got a few things to say, I'm sure.
I'm going to bribe people.
Oh, good. I like bribery. I've got some prizes.
Fill in your evaluation form, or you don't want to. Is that good enough?
That was short and sharp.
Now, also, I suppose I've got to thank the sponsors. I have to read it off because it's a massive list. I couldn't have had Chris today. So this was actually a joint delivery between Avongro, the Forever Project, which is you, and Northern Agricultural Catchments Council. And funding for this came from Caring for Our Country, DAFWA, the Natural Disaster Resilience Programme, and Moore Catchment Council. So I think we should all show our appreciation for Chris, because he has really done well today, I reckon.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we've run over time because we've just got so much to say.
I know this.